Bedtime Reading. The Awakening. Chapter 1. Outside the door, a parrot in a cage repeated again and again in French,
Allez-vous-en, sapristi. That's okay.
He spoke a little Spanish as well, and some other language unfamiliar to the human ear. On the other side of the door, there was a mockingbird, which kept whistling in a high voice without stopping. Mr. Pontellier had been sitting in front of the main house with a newspaper, but couldn't read with all the noise. He got up from his chair with an angry, impatient face and walked away. The birds belonged to Madame Lebrun, so they could make as much noise as they wanted. He walked 4 doors down to his cottage and sat in a rocking chair out front. Once again, he tried to read the newspaper. It was Sunday. The newspaper was from the day before, for Sunday's paper had not arrived yet. He was already familiar with the market reports. He read the editorials and some news, which he had not had an opportunity to read the day before when he was leaving New Orleans. Mr. Pontellier was 40 years old. He wore glasses, was of medium height and quite slim, but walked with a bowed back. He had straight brown hair and a tidy beard. Now and then, his eyes moved away from the paper and looked around. There was even more noise now over at the house. The main building on Grand Isle was called the house, in order to separate it from all the little cottages that surrounded it. The birds were still there, singing and chirping, and the 2 Farival girls were playing the piano. Madame Lebrun rushed in and out, ordering around the gardener and the dining-room servant in a high voice. She was pretty and always dressed in white clothing. Further away, in front of one of the homes, a woman wearing black was walking quietly and praying to her beads. Those who had not taken Mr. Baudelaire's boat to go to church earlier that morning were playing croquet in the nearby fields. Among them were 2 of Mr. Pontellier's own boys. As Mr. Pontellier started to smoke, he saw an umbrella approaching from the beach. The distance between him and the umbrella seemed large through the trees. Underneath the umbrella were his wife and Robert Lebrun, Madame Lebrun's son. They seemed tired when they finally arrived at the cottage and took their seats.
You must be crazy.
Mr. Pontellier shouted.
Swimming at this late hour when the sun is so hot.
He had swum much earlier in the day, at sunrise.
Your skin burns so much that I can't even recognize you,
Mr. Pontellier said, looking at his wife as if his precious treasure had just been destroyed. She raised her arms and carefully looked at her hands. This reminded her that she had given her rings to her husband before going to the beach. Without saying anything, she put out her hand. Mr. Pontellier understood what she meant and took the rings out from his shirt and put them in her hand. Looking at Robert, she placed them on her fingers and started to laugh. He gave her a secret smile in return.
What's this smile of yours?
Mr. Pontellier asked, looking at both of them. It was something silly, something that had happened while they were in the water. They tried to tell him about it, but in the middle of the story realized it was not as funny as they had remembered. Mr. Pontellier stood up and told them that he wanted to go play pool.
"Come on, Robert,"
he suggested, but Robert told him that he would rather stay and talk with Mrs. Pontellier.
"Send him away when you finish with him,"
said Mr. Pontellier as he was leaving. Handing him her umbrella, Edna asked, "Are you coming back for dinner?" He answered by raising his shoulders momentarily and then letting them drop. He didn't know. Maybe he would, maybe he would not. It depended on how the game was. Chapter 2. Mrs. Pontellier had a pair of bright eyes, which were yellowish-brown, a similar color to her hair. She could move them quickly and look at something in a way which made it seem that she was thinking very hard. Her eyebrows had a darker color than her hair. They were straight and full, making her eyes look even deeper. Handsome is a better word to describe her than beautiful. She had a charming nature, and people found her easy to talk with. Without much money to buy cigars, Robert often rolled his own cigarettes. He was doing so now. Mr. Pontellier had given him a cigar earlier in the day, but he wanted to smoke it after dinner. His appearance was a little similar to Mrs. Pontellier's. They had a similar skin color. They couldn't stop chatting about everything that was happening on the little island. They talked about their experience in the water. It had, once again, become interesting to them. About the people who had gone to church earlier that morning, about the children who were playing croquet, and the two Farival girls who they could hear still playing piano. They also talked about themselves. Robert told her that he wanted to go to Mexico. In fact, he had always wanted to go, but for some reason he could not. In the meantime, he worked for a company in New Orleans, where his ability to speak French and Spanish was considered very useful. He was at Grand Isle with his mother for the holiday. The house had once been a summer home for the Lebrun family. Now, however, it had been turned into a vacation spot for the wealthy residents of New Orleans' French Quarter. So that more of them could come and enjoy the island, many small cottages were built around the house. All of this provided Madame Lebrun with enough money to live a very easy and comfortable life. Mrs. Pontellier started to talk about her father's farm and her childhood in Kentucky. She told Robert about a letter she had just received from her sister, who was going to get married. Robert was so interested in her sister and asked many questions about her family that, by the time she finished reading the letter, it was already time for her to change clothing for supper. "It seems like Leonce's pool game is going well," she said, while preparing to leave. Robert had not thought Mr. Pontellier would return, because there would be a lot of people at the club with whom he could play. After his chat with Mrs. Pontellier, Robert walked over to where the croquet players were. He played with the Pontellier boys, who liked him very much. Chapter 3. Mr. Pontellier came back from Klein's Hotel at 11 o'clock. It was a great night. He was excited and talked a lot. His wife, who had been asleep for several hours, woke up to the sound of his entering the bedroom. He told her some of the stories and jokes he had heard that night, but she was too tired to answer him. He felt disappointed that his wife, who was the most important thing in his life, showed so little interest in what he said. Mr. Pontellier had meant to bring candies and peanuts home for his sons, but the idea had completely left his mind while playing pool. He loved his children very much, and he went to their room to make sure they were sleeping well. What he found did not make him happy. One of them, Raoul, was rolling about in bed and talking in his sleep. He went back to his wife and told her that Raoul had a temperature and needed to be cared for. He then went over to the chair by the bedroom window and relaxed for a bit while smoking a cigarette. Mrs. Pontellier was pretty sure that Raoul did not have any fever. She explained to her husband that the boy was fine and that there was nothing strange about him during the day. Mr. Pontellier, however, was sure that he was correct. He then yelled at his wife for not caring for the kids enough. He could not do it himself because it was his responsibility to go out and make money for the whole family. It was her job, and she was not doing it well enough. Mrs. Pontellier jumped out of bed and ran to the next room to check on the boys. When she came back, she did not speak a word to her husband, but simply got back into bed. Mr. Pontellier changed his clothes and then got into bed as well. He fell asleep almost immediately. Mrs. Pontellier, however, could not sleep any more. She started to cry, using her sleeves to wipe the tears. She put on her shoes, went to the porch, and seated herself in a chair. It was after midnight and everything was dark and quiet. There was only the sound of a bird high up in a tree and the insistent voice of the ocean. Everything sounded sad. Mrs. Pontellier could not stop crying. She did not know why she was so sad. Before now, she had always appreciated her husband's sweetness. Unpleasant thoughts about him had never entered her mind. She never questioned her happiness. She felt a kind of pressure that she was not able to describe. It came from a strange area of her mind. An unclear pain surrounded her. She did not blame her husband. She was just letting herself have a good, long cry. The next morning, Mr. Pontellier got up early to prepare to go back to New Orleans. He would be gone for a full week. He had calmed down about the night before and was looking forward to getting back to work. Before leaving, Mr. Pontellier gave his wife half of the money he had won the night before at the club. She happily accepted it. She counted the money and said, "I'll use this to buy a wedding dress for my sister, Janet." He laughed, kissed his wife, and then said goodbye. Everybody loved Mr. Pontellier. It was common for the other guests and staff to gather to say goodbye to him. Everyone waved and smiled to him until his car turned a corner and drove out of sight. Several days later, Mrs. Pontellier got a package from her husband from New Orleans. In it were the best fruits available, as well as several bottles of syrup and plenty of candies for the kids. Mrs. Pontellier shared the box with all of the ladies and their children. They took away handfuls of the food and said that Mr. Pontellier was the best husband they'd ever seen. Mrs. Pontellier had no choice but to agree. Chapter 4. In fact, it was not easy for Mr. Pontellier to criticize his wife for not taking good care of the kids. He did not have any clear proof that she did a poor job. Because of this, every time after he became angry and said something about it to Mrs. Pontellier. He always felt sorry later on and tried to make up for it in some way. If their boys hurt themselves while playing, they would not come crying to their mother for help. Instead, they would simply get back on their feet and continue to play. Kids like them liked to be rough with one another, and they would get into all kinds of fights with the other little boys. They could not stand the nurse, whom they felt was only useful for helping them to keep a good appearance, fixing their hair for them, wiping the dirt from their clothes, and so on. Mrs. Pontellier was not a very motherly mother. All of the other mothers at Grand Isle were the type who never stopped protecting their children. No injury was too small for them to get upset about. For them, their children were the most precious things in the world. So they saw their main purpose in life was to watch over them as carefully as possible. One of the mothers at Grand Isle, a woman named Adele Ratignolle, was very much this kind of mother. Her physical attractiveness was so obvious that only the most uncommon words could be used to describe her. She was like a female hero from a traditional novel. Her husband would have to have been a complete idiot not to love her with all of his heart and soul. She had beautiful golden hair that refused to be held up on her head by a pin. Her blue eyes were like precious stones. Her lips had the redness of freshly picked cherries. She was getting a little fatter, but it did not really matter. Her beauty was no less perfect than before. Nothing bad could be said about any part of her body, not her arms, her neck, or her legs. It was a pleasure to look at her pretty hands as they worked in the afternoon sunlight, sewing clothing for her children. Madame Ratignolle liked Mrs. Pontellier very much, and would often spend her afternoons sewing on the Pontelliers' front porch. In fact, she was present when the box from Mr. Pontellier arrived. At the time, she was making clothing for her children to sleep in. The design she had in mind for the baby's clothing was very strange. The material would completely cover the child, only allowing for the baby's mouth, eyes, and nose to be seen. She wanted to protect the child from the cold air that can quietly enter houses during the winter and make people ill. Mrs. Pontellier thought that this was a bit too much. She herself did not think it was necessary to spend her summer vacation worrying about the winter that would come 5 or 6 months from now. However, she did not want to be unfriendly, so she agreed to help Mrs. Ratignolle make the clothing. With them, as they began to cut the material, was Robert. Mrs. Pontellier sat on the staircase, occasionally passing candy to her friend, Madame Ratignolle. Madame could not decide which piece of candy she wanted. She wondered if some of them might be unhealthier than the others. Would they make her fat? Eventually, she chose a piece of dark chocolate and put it into her cherry-red mouth. She was already 7 years married. She had 3 children and was planning to have a 4th one in the near future. Very often she would talk about some problem or illness that she had. There was nothing to make anyone believe that these illnesses were real. Madame Ratignolle always looked perfectly healthy, but she insisted that she was ill in some way. Robert tried to comfort her by telling her that he had heard of a woman who had lived on nothing but chocolate for many years. But seeing Madame Ratignolle's face become more serious, he decided to stop telling the story and talk about something else completely unrelated. Mr. Pontellier was a Creole. The Creoles were people with French and Spanish ancestors who combined their European culture with the culture of the southern United States, specifically within the state of Louisiana. Mrs. Pontellier still felt quite uncomfortable around her husband's Creole family and most Creole people in general. Most of the people at Mrs. Lebrun's were Creole. They had an easy way of talking around one another. They were not afraid to say how they felt about anything. And they were not shy about talking about even the most personal things. This kind of expressive freedom was difficult for Mrs. Pontellier to get used to. Often, when she heard such conversations, her face would turn red from embarrassment. But the more time she spent among the Creoles, the more comfortable she began to feel. Chapter 5. The 3 of them enjoyed a nice, friendly atmosphere, sitting on the Pontelliers' front porch in the afternoon. Madame Ratignolle would frequently interrupt her sewing to tell jokes or talk about her illness, always with the assistance of her beautiful hands. Mrs. Pontellier and the young Robert would sit quietly and listen, often looking at one another in such a way that it seemed they had a very close relationship. For the last 30 days it was very seldom that Robert was not near Mrs. Pontellier. This came as no surprise to anyone. It was his habit to make himself a close friend of a young girl or woman during his summer holidays at Grand Isle. He had been doing it since he was quite young. For some reason, he was always attracted to women who had husbands. For 2 summers in a row, he had stayed by the side of Miss Duveen. However, after the 2nd summer, she became ill and soon died. Robert then acted as though he could never be happy again and looked to Madame Ratignolle to comfort him. Mrs. Pontellier found Robert to be very attractive. To her, he was like a perfect god. She enjoyed looking at him for long periods of time.
Does anybody understand the evil that hides underneath that woman's beauty?
Robert asked, talking about Madame Ratignolle.
She was totally aware of the fact that I loved her before, and she used it against me, always ordering me around, getting me to do things for her. Come here, Robert. Go there, Robert. Read to me, Robert.
What did you expect? You were always sitting at the bottom of my chair, like a little pet, Madame Ratignolle answered.
Yes, just like a stupid little dog.
Maybe I didn't want to upset my husband, she said, making a joke. Everyone began to laugh at this. Creole men never worried about their wives. They were too used to not feeling anything toward them. Then Robert began to talk more about the time he was hopelessly in love with Madame Ratignolle. He mentioned how impossible it was for him to sleep at night how he could not stop thinking about her. While he told this story, Madame Ratignolle would occasionally throw in humorous comments of her own. "What a beast you are! Get out of here!" she would say. He had never been this way when he was with Mrs. Pontellier. She could not tell when he was joking or when he was not joking. Clearly, he had expressed his love for Madame Ratignolle without expecting her to return the same feelings. Mrs. Pontellier was happy that he did not behave in the same way toward her. She would not have liked it and would have felt he was troublesome. Mrs. Pontellier loved to draw. She had never seriously studied drawing, nor was her talent very great. She simply enjoyed doing it. That summer, she had made it a point to bring her pencils and paper with her to Grand Isle. For a long time, she had wanted to draw Madame Ratignolle. At this moment, with the combination of Robert's stories and the afternoon sunlight shining through her hair, Madame Ratignolle seemed even more worth drawing. Robert came over to where Mrs. Pontellier was sitting so that he could watch her draw. She moved her pencil along the paper with little effort, making it clear that she was never properly trained, but had quite a natural talent for the art. He watched her carefully and occasionally made little comments of praise.
"Wonderful! You are talented."
At one moment, while she was drawing, Mrs. Pontellier felt Robert put his head on her arm. She was very polite in refusing him. However, he did it again a few moments later. She guessed that he must have known what he was doing, but that did not mean she had to accept it. Once more, she refused him with a movement of her arm. He did not say, "Excuse me." The painting, when it was finished, looked nothing at all like Madame Ratignolle, but it was still a good work in many ways. Mrs. Pontellier, however, did not feel it was worth keeping. Looking it over for a moment, she suddenly moved her pencil across the paper and then tore the paper into 4 pieces. The kids came back with the nurse, walking a few meters behind them. They ran up the stairs, and Mrs. Pontellier asked them to take her art supplies into the cottage for her. She hoped that they might stay a while and chat, but it was clear that they were only interested in finding out what was in the box from their father. They let their mother decide what kind of candies they could have, and then, once their hands were full, ran into the house to eat them up. The sun was beginning to go down, and the wind carried the smell of the sea to each of their noses. Children were getting together under the oak trees to play games, screaming and yelling with excitement. Madame Ratignolle collected her sewing tools neatly and safely, and then mentioned that she was feeling a little dizzy. Mrs. Pontellier ran over to spray some water on her face and fanned it. Robert helped as well. Soon, Madame Ratignolle felt better. However, Mrs. Pontellier could not help wondering if her friend had been faking, because the color of her face had not really changed. She watched as Madame Ratignolle walked back toward her cottage. She met her 3 children and their nurse along the way. It was obvious by the way she greeted them that she loved her children very much. She even picked the smallest one up and carried her in her arms. something she had said her doctor did not allow her to do.
"Is it time for a swim?"
Robert asked Mrs. Pontellier. "Well," she answered, not having decided yet what she wanted to do, "I'm a little sleepy now. Maybe tomorrow." She then looked out to the sea and felt as though it was calling to her.
"What?"
he cried.
"How can you say no? The water is great. Come on."
He got her hat from the wall and placed it on her head. They then walked to the beach together. The sun was beginning to set, and the wind blew around them gently. Chapter 6. Edna Pontellier had wanted to go to the beach with her young friend. Why had she refused at first? That was what she was confused about. What was wrong with going to the beach with Robert? And if she did secretly feel that it was wrong, why did she go? Something was changing inside of her. She was becoming aware of a different person within herself. Every day, her knowledge of this person became stronger and stronger. In other words, Edna's understanding of herself was increasing very suddenly. It was hard for her to accept at first. That was a lot to put on a young 28-year-old woman. Revolutions hardly ever go smoothly in the beginning. Often people have to suffer, even die, in order for the changes to be complete. So many people fail and die trying. The ocean calls out to people's souls to come to it and get lost in their own thoughts, to be alone with it. The water of the sea gently puts its arms around you and makes you feel safe. Chapter 7. Mrs. Pontellier was always a quiet and shy woman. Her feelings about herself were very modest. At a young age, she had become aware of the two people that live in a body. There's the person that everyone knows and sees, who behaves as everyone else behaves. And there's the other person deep inside that watches and asks, "Is this right? Is this who I am?" But from this summer at Grand Isle, Edna's shyness started to lessen. The biggest reason for this change was probably Adele Ratignolle. Her physical beauty was what first got Edna's attention, but then it was her openness that seemed so interesting. She hid nothing from anyone. Something inside of Edna saw this and said, "This is right." Compared to her friend, Edna was full of secret desires and opinions. This suddenly seemed unnatural to Edna and needed to be changed. One morning, Edna managed to get Adele to go with her alone to the beach. It was difficult getting her to agree to leave her kids at home, and she still insisted on bringing her sewing with her. And it was no small wonder how they managed to avoid Robert. The walk to the beach was not an easy one. It was quite far, and the path was occasionally covered in small weeds that had to be walked around in order not to lose your shoe. Along the way could be seen many yellow flowers and vegetable gardens, as well as fields full of orange and lemon trees. Both women were tall. However, their bodies had a very different shape from one another. Madame Ratignolle's beauty was much more obvious than Edna Pontellier's. In fact, most people would pass their eyes over Edna without taking another look. They would have found her quite unimpressive. However, those who took the time to look at her more carefully would discover something attractive about her, although it would be hard for them to describe what it was that made her attractive. Her beauty was special and could not be found in anyone else. Madame Ratignolle wore clothing that protected her skin from the sun and the wind. She was very careful about keeping her beauty. She dressed all in white to keep her from being hot. Although she covered herself up in this way, her beauty could still clearly be seen. Along the beach were many bathing cottages. Each one had 2 sections inside. Each section belonged to a different family. Coincidentally, the Pontellier and Ratignolle families shared the same cottage. Today, however, the 2 women had not intended to bathe. They only desired to be near the sea. Edna entered the Pontellier section of the cottage and brought out a small carpet, which she then laid on the front porch, facing the sea. She also placed 2 large pillows against the back wall of the porch, so that they could sit up and look out at the water. They sat down, hidden from the sun, and made themselves comfortable. Madame Ratignolle tried to keep herself cool by waving a fan in her face, while Edna unbuttoned the top of her dress in order to let the air in. At first they did nothing but make comments about the temperature and the brightness of the day. The wind then became stronger and began to blow the women's dresses, causing them to change their sitting position and fix their hair. It was quiet on the beach. The only other people there were a couple of young men who were playing in the water, an old woman reading in front of another cottage, and 2 young lovers talking under a tent. The day was so clear, Edna could see far out in the distance. There were sailboats out on the water. They looked like they were not moving. "Whom are you thinking about?" Adele asked, while laughing a little to herself. She had been looking at her friend's face, which had become so still that she seemed to be made of stone. "No one," Edna answered. Then she added, "I hate it that people always answer this question in this way. If I take a moment, I might actually remember what I was thinking about." "Forget it. I don't have to know every thought that goes through your head. Besides, the heat today makes it difficult to think clearly." "No, I might enjoy remembering, actually. I was thinking about how the sea seems to just keep going without end. And those boats out there, they make such a lovely picture, don't they? Oh, and the wind's warmth reminded me, for some reason, of a time when I was young and walking through an area of tall grass in Kentucky. The grass was so high it came up to my chest. It was like being in water, actually. I felt that I was almost swimming in the grass." "Were you going anywhere?" asked Madame Ratignolle. "I don't recall. I might just have been walking. I remember thinking that the field, much like the sea here, never ended. I can't really remember how it made me feel. Maybe I was a bit afraid. Then again, maybe I quite enjoyed it. It sounds similar to the way I used to run away from church. It always frightened me the way my father read through the Bible in such a serious voice. Did you used to do the same thing? Asked Madame Ratignolle. No, I did not think much when I was a child. I just did what I was expected to do. Then suddenly she leaned over to Madame Ratignolle and said, I don't know why, but lately I felt like I'm crossing the field again without thinking about anything and without knowing where I'm going. Ratignolle put her hand on Edna's. Noticing that she didn't take it back, she patted it a little bit amusedly and then whispered, Poor friend. Edna did not quite understand her action, but she eventually accepted it as Creole kindness. She was not the kind of person who liked to share her feelings with others. As a young girl, she and her little sister Janet always fought. Her big sister Margaret was like a mother to them because their mother had died while they were still very young. She also did not like to show much emotion. And all of Edna's friends were shy. Her closest friend was one of the most intelligent girls in her school. She liked to write, and they would often talk about their favorite books together. And their conversations sometimes even became quite serious, especially when talking about religion and politics. Edna was bothered by a particular habit of hers. It first showed itself when a handsome officer had come to see her father. She was very young at the time, but she still found herself falling madly in love with him. She always had to be near him, and she found it difficult to stop looking at him. But he eventually went away and never returned. Another time, she fell in love with a man who was engaged to be married. The lucky fiancé lived next door to Edna, actually. And occasionally, she and this man would come over to visit with Margaret. It made Edna sad to see how unimportant she was in this man's eyes. He obviously did not feel anything for her. And he too eventually went away, never to return. Years later, she started to love a famous writer. This man had, of course, died a long time ago, but that did not stop her from imagining his face and body. She felt that it was the most she would ever love anyone. The impossibility of it made her love seem even more real than before. She kept a drawing of him on a table in her bedroom. No one ever thought it strange, for it was perfectly normal to admire a famous writer. She would always praise his work while passing the picture around her friends to look at. But when she was alone, she would sometimes press her lips against the great man's face. She did not mean to marry her husband, Léoncé. He met her and fell in love almost immediately, which is quite common for men to do. At the time, Edna was still in love with the writer. However, Mr. Pontellier dressed very well for her and always praised her. She enjoyed this, and it made her start to think that maybe they were suited for one another. Of course, this was not true, but she could not have possibly known that then. The fact that her father and older sister disagreed with the relationship only made her want it more. Ideally, she would have liked to marry the writer, but this was impossible. Instead, she could marry a man who was crazy about her, and that would have to be enough. Over time, she began to like it that her feelings for Léoncé were not dominated by unrealistic romance and passion. She found something comforting and natural in that. Her feelings for her children were not always the same. She loved them, of course, but there were times when she hardly ever thought about them. When Edna spent the summer before alone with her grandmother, she often liked it that her children were not around. It was nice not having to deal with them. Sometimes, however, she would suddenly miss them greatly. But that moment would pass and soon be replaced by a sense of comfort and freedom. Edna did not share all of this with Madame Ratignolle that day they were sitting on the beach together. But some of it did come out as she put her head on her friend's shoulder and enjoyed the feeling of being open with another person. They then heard some people coming. Robert soon could be seen walking with a group of kids. He was, of course, looking for the two women. He had both Edna's and Adèle's children with him. Edna got to her feet, put the rug and pillows away, and then began to play with her children. Madame Ratignolle asked Robert to help her walk back to the house, since her legs were hurting. She put her arms around his waist and they headed back, away from the sea. Chapter 8. "Would you do something for me, Robert?" Madame Ratignolle asked on their way back home.
"Whatever you say,"
Robert answered her, noticing the seriousness in her face. "It's quite simple, actually. Don't encourage Mrs. Pontellier. Don't bother her any more."
"Ha ha ha! Madame Ratignolle is jealous."
Robert laughed. "Really, I'm serious now. Don't bother her any longer."
"Why?"
Robert asked, the smile leaving his face. "She is not the same as us. She might not realize that you're joking with her when you say the things that you say."
"Is everything I say supposed to be a joke?"
Robert said, a little angrily.
"Am I here to simply entertain everyone? Maybe I want someone to be serious with me for once."
"Robert, stop," she interrupted. "Listen to what you're saying. You make about as much sense as one of those children you were walking with a few minutes ago. People don't take you seriously because they know you're not a bad person. People trust you. The way you behave with married women would be wrong if you were serious about it."
"Such things are not nice to say to a man,"
Robert said, throwing his hat back onto his head. "Then I guess our whole friendship should be built upon nothing but praise for one another?"
"Well, it's not fun hearing such things from a woman,"
he said, suddenly stopping. Then he began to change the subject, talking about the story of the famous French singer who once got involved in a relationship he should have avoided. Before Madame Ratignolle went into her cottage to take a rest, Robert apologized politely for his behavior. He meant to express that he understood her advice.
"However, I think it's more possible that I will take myself seriously before she does. But I appreciate your suggestion. It will certainly make me think about my behavior in the future. Are you tired? Why don't I make you a drink and a bowl of hot soup? It will help you to relax."
She accepted his offer and went into her home to wait while he ran to the kitchen to prepare the food for her. A little while later he reappeared, carrying a brown bowl. "You're a good boy, Robert," she said, taking the bowl from his hands. He thanked her and then walked back out into the sunshine. People could now be seen returning from the beach, but Mrs. Pontellier and the kids were not among them. Robert was pretty sure that they would not be back until dinner. He then decided to look for her from the window of his mother's bedroom, which overlooked the beach area. Madame Lebrun was using her sewing machine with the help of a young black girl. Robert took a seat on the window-sill and began to try reading a book. Madame Lebrun's machine was very noisy, for it was an old model. During her breaks, she and her son would casually talk. "Is Mrs. Pontellier around?" she asked.
"No, she's at the beach. What's the matter?"
"I wanted to let her borrow one of my books by Goncourt. Could you give it to her the next time you see her?" Then, after about 10 minutes of more sewing noise, she spoke again. "Is Victor taking the car?"
"Huh? The car?"
"Quick! Yell to him before he goes." Both Robert and Madame Lebrun attempted to get young Victor's attention. They screamed, yelled, and even whistled, but he refused to look up at them. Eventually, he drove away. Madame Lebrun became angry and went back to her sewing with a red face. Victor was the youngest boy of the Lebrun family. He was very uncooperative and stubborn. He always did what he wanted, whether his mother approved or not.
"If you'd let me, I'd be happy to beat some sense into him,"
said Robert. "I just wish your father were still alive," Madame Lebrun said, before returning to her sewing. She believed that the whole world would be a better place if her husband had not died.
"Did Montel write you a letter?"
asked Robert. Montel, for the past 20 years, had been making efforts to replace the dead Mr. Lebrun. "Yes, he did. It's somewhere around here. He mentioned something about meeting you in Vera Cruz next month."
"And you're just now telling me? Why did you wait so long?"
"Has Mrs. Pontellier returned from the beach yet? I can't imagine her not coming back for lunch."
"Where's the book you wanted to lend her?"
Chapter 9. The weekend had arrived, and it was Saturday evening. 2 weeks had passed since Adele and Robert had had their talk about Edna. Every light in the large dining hall was lit, and all of the tables had been taken away to make room for the large number of guests who were now gathered there. Many relatives, mainly fathers and husbands, had come to Grand Isle to visit their children and wives for a day and an evening. Chairs were placed around the room so that little groups could be formed for conversation. The people shared with their families the stories and news of the past week. Then, after a while, the little groups started to open up to those who were not family members. And soon the occasion became a social gathering for the community. Once everyone felt easy and calm, the gathering started to become a little more active. Music began to be performed, and then people started to dance. Games were played, and the children eagerly looked through the comic books Mr. Pontellier had brought with him from the city. Then the guests asked the Farival twins to play something on the piano for them. They played 2 songs for the party, and everyone was quite happy with their performance. Madame Lebrun's bird cried,
Allez-vous-en, sapristi! He
was the only one at the party who did not pretend he had not heard them play these songs before. The twins' grandfather got angry with the bird and demanded that it be removed from the party. Victor Lebrun refused. Luckily, the bird did not make any further comments for the rest of the performance. And then a young girl danced for everyone, while her mother played the piano. She was dressed perfectly for the occasion. She wore a little black dress with black shoes. Her movements were very smooth and surprisingly quick. She obviously practiced very often. Madame Ratignolle then decided to play a waltz on the piano, so that everyone else could now dance all together. She played beautifully and made the dance quite enjoyable to the guests who participated. In fact, the only people who did not participate were the Farival twins. They could not stand the idea of being separated, and they did not think of the possibility of simply dancing with each other. Afterwards, ice cream and cake were served to the guests. Victor had arranged this, and, seeing how everybody seemed to like the food, he felt proud that it had turned out well, and made it a point to encourage everyone to eat more. And then it was time for the kids to go to bed. Some did as their parents asked them, while others cried and insisted that they be allowed to stay up longer. Mrs. Pontellier danced several times throughout the night, a few times with her husband, as well as once with Robert and Mr. Ratignolle. Feeling a bit hot and tired, she went to the front of the building to sit for a moment and watch both the guests and the sea. The moon was bright that evening, throwing its light down upon the water. Then Robert joined her outside and asked if she would like for Miss Rice to play some music. Edna did want this, but she felt that the woman would not feel like playing. Robert, hearing this, decided to do his best to get her to come and perform. Miss Rice was not a very friendly or social person. However, it was not too hard for Robert to get her to agree to come to the party. She came into the dining hall wearing an ugly dress with fake flowers in her hair. Her face showed no emotion at all. She walked directly to the piano. "What does Mrs. Pontellier want to hear?" asked Miss Rice, sitting at the instrument with her hands down at her sides. Everyone had stopped talking. There was a feeling of curiosity throughout the room. Edna felt embarrassed being the center of attention. "Anything Miss Rice would like to play would be fine," she said. Mrs. Pontellier thought of herself as a music lover. When someone managed to play a piece of music well, it caused all kinds of emotions to rise within her. She would often sit quietly and listen to Madame Ratignolle practice in the mornings. Her friend explained that she continued to play because she thought it was good for her children to often hear music in the house. One of the songs Adele played made Edna think of a man wearing no clothing standing next to the sea. She did not know the name of the song, but she liked to call it Alone. She imagined the man watching a bird flying across the sky. The man felt lonely and without hope. Some of the other songs she played made Edna think of children running around together in a field, or of an old woman holding a cat in her arms. The very first sound made by Miss Rice on the piano caused Edna to shake in her chair. This woman was a true piano player. Her playing did not have the same effect on Mrs. Pontellier as the songs of Madame Ratignolle. Instead of seeing images in her mind, Edna became full of emotion. The music demanded a response from her very soul. She began to cry. When the woman finished playing, she immediately stood up from the piano seat and walked out of the room without looking at anyone. Outside, she approached Edna. "So, what did you think?" she asked. Edna could not say anything. Her tears prevented her from seeing and speaking. Miss Rice understood and put her hand on Edna's arm. "When I play here at Grand Isle, I only play for you. Everyone else is a damned fool." And then Miss Rice went back to her cottage and locked the door. However, she did not realize that those other fools had appreciated her playing very much. The crowd of people in the dining hall could not stop talking about her beautiful playing. "She's the best I've ever heard," some shouted, while others claimed that she expressed every composer's ideas perfectly when she played. The hour was approaching midnight when the party came to an end. Everyone began to return to his or her cottages to prepare for bed. However, one person had the idea of going for a swim at that late hour. Chapter 10. The idea to go for a swim had, of course, been Robert's. He made the suggestion, and many people decided that it was an excellent idea and headed right away for the beach. Robert, however, was the last to go. He wanted to be among the couple. He would chat with them and sometimes even stand in the middle, separating the two lovers. No one knew why he did this. Was he joking or being mean? Robert himself did not even know. Edna, who was walking with her husband and the Ratignolles, was aware of Robert walking some distance behind her. She thought it strange that he chose not to walk with them. It made her think about how lately he had not been spending as much time with her as before. She found that she missed his company when he was not around. The air was full of interesting smells and sounds, all surrounding the various groups of people walking toward the sea. Music could be heard coming from a nearby hotel, and there was the smell of freshly cut grass and recently dug dirt. The night sky was full of the moon's soft brightness. The sea was very calm. Everyone went into the water as naturally as they walked in the fields. Edna, who, up until that time, had not known how to swim, suddenly found herself able to do it on her own. It was like a young child realizing for the first time that it could walk. She cried out happily. She felt as though she had total control over her body and could do almost anything. Everyone who had tried to teach her to swim that summer felt that it was his lessons that had finally helped her to be successful. "It's so simple," Edna thought to herself. "Why did it take me so long to realize how simple it is?" She had no desire to join the others in their games in the water. She wanted to enjoy the feeling of swimming all on her own. She swam toward the light of the moon on the water. It seemed as though she were reaching for the end of the world every time she stretched her arms forward. After a short while, she looked back to to see how far she had gone. In fact, she was still quite close to the beach. However, for a new swimmer, the distance seemed quite great. She felt as though she would never be able to get back. For a moment, she believed that she might die out there, but then she managed to gather up enough strength to make it back safely. She did not tell anyone except her husband about her moment of fear. "I thought that I was in serious trouble out there."
No, no. You were still quite near. I had my eye on you the whole time,
her husband assured her. Edna then got out of the water, dried herself off, and, after changing into her evening clothes, began to walk back to her cottage. The people in the water began to shout for her to come back. She just raised her hand and waved to say, "No thanks," and continued along the path. A few minutes later, Robert caught up with her. "I didn't leave because I feared the water," she said.
I know that,
he answered. "Well, why did you stop swimming and come to me now?"
I don't know.
"What do you mean you don't know?"
I just don't.
"Oh, I have no more energy."
I thought you were tired.
"What do you mean? How should you know I'm tired? You can't possibly understand what I'm feeling this evening. It's been such a wonderfully unusual night. I don't think I'll ever experience another one like it. Everything seems different. The people around me seem to be almost ghosts."
That's because there are ghosts out tonight,
said Robert.
It's the 28th of August.
"What day is that?"
Every year on this day, an old ghost will come from out of the sea and look for the best human to join him, for a short time, in the mysterious world in which he lives. He comes at 12 o'clock at night, and only if the moon is bright. Up until this year, he has never found anyone who was good enough. But this year he has chosen you. And it's possible he may never remove this wonderful feeling you now have. As a result, in the future, you may find that being with humans is quite boring and unpleasant.
"Don't make fun of me," Edna said. It upset her that Robert did not seem to take her seriously. However, she did not realize that he had been quite serious. He knew what she was feeling. Instead of explaining, he simply gave her his arm to hold on to, for she was tired. She accepted his arm, but continued to use her own strength to carry herself forward. She was not thinking about her tiredness now. Her mind was somewhere else, and she was trying to catch up with it. Robert helped her to lie down on a hammock that was in front of her cottage.
"Will you remain outside until your husband returns?"
he asked. "Yes, goodbye," she said.
"Do you want a pillow?"
"I have one already," she answered, searching for it through the darkness.
"Oh, but it's dirty. Your kids must have been playing with it."
"It's fine." She placed the pillow comfortably under her head. Then, taking a big breath, she relaxed into the hammock.
"How about I wait here with you for your husband?"
he suggested, sitting down on the porch floor and taking hold of the rope that connected the hammock to a nearby tree. "It's up to you. Please, don't move the hammock. Would you mind handing me the sweater that's sitting in the window over there?"
"Of course. Are you getting cold?"
"Not yet, but I think I will soon.
Do you realize how late it is now? Will you stay out here for a long time?
Could you just hand me my sweater, please? He got up and walked across the yard to the window. Edna followed him with her eyes as he passed under different areas of shadow and moonlight. The night was silent. He then returned with her sweater, and she took it from him, but did not put it on.
I can't remember. Am I to wait for a Mr. Pontellier with you?
He asked. I said that you could do whatever you wanted, she answered. He then decided to make a new cigarette. Once he finished, he lit it and smoked quietly. Nobody said a word for the rest of the night, because it would have been impossible to put into words how much they wanted one another at that moment. Soon, they could hear the other people returning from the beach. Robert stood up immediately and told her good night before walking away. She did not respond, but simply followed him with her eyes again as he passed through the darkness and light of the night. Chapter 11. Mr. Pontellier walked back with Madame Lebrun and found Edna resting outside.
What are you doing outside? Why aren't you resting in bed?
He asked. Edna said nothing.
Are you awake?
Mr. Pontellier asked, putting his face near hers. Yes, she answered, looking at him, without any sign that she was sleepy.
It's almost 2:00, and it's cold out here. Let's go inside and get some sleep.
He then entered the cottage and, after a few minutes had passed, called to her to come inside. I'll come in a little later, she replied. Returning to the door and sticking his head outside, he asked,
What's wrong with you? Why do you remain out here where it's so cold?
I'm fine. I've got my sweater.
But the insects will eat you alive.
They're not bothering me now. She could hear him walking about the inside of the cottage. He was clearly upset. Usually, she would have done what he asked her to. She did not often think about whether she should or should not. It was simply her habit to do as he asked.
Please, Edna, why don't you come in here with me?
He asked her very gently. No, thanks. I'm quite comfortable out here.
Now, look here, woman. You come in here immediately. Stop behaving so strangely.
She felt that she had never had this experience with her husband before. This was something new. She was resisting him, fighting him. And it was something that she could not stop herself from doing. The feeling was too strong inside of her to stop it. Léonce, I plan to stay out here. You go on and go to bed yourself. Stop yelling at me. The next time you do, I'll not listen, she said. He did not go to bed, however. Instead, he got a bottle of wine and joined Edna on the porch. She refused the glass that he offered her. He then pulled up a chair near her hammock and smoked a couple of cigars. After that, he went back inside, put on some warmer clothing, and poured himself another glass of wine. Once again, Edna refused to drink, and he smoked a few more cigars. The feeling that the ghost had put over Edna was beginning to leave her. She was becoming more and more aware of her real life now. It suddenly made her very tired, she had no more strength to fight any longer. That was the quietest time of the night, the time when everything seems to become silent, waiting for the sun to arise once again. Edna got up from the hammock. Her legs had no feeling after having lain there for so long. She moved slowly to the house and turned around to her husband. "Coming to bed?"
"I'll be in after this cigar,"
Mr. Pontellier answered. Chapter 12. Edna hardly slept at all during the 3 hours that she was in bed. Her dreams were full of anxious desires that she felt could never be achieved. She got out of bed very early and walked out into the cool morning air. The coolness sharpened her senses, but she did not care, for she had decided to simply follow her natural feeling. And it seemed as though this natural feeling were created by something outside of herself. She no longer felt responsible for her actions. Hardly anyone else was up at that hour. Only those who were going to church and those same lovers from the other day at the beach were out and about. Oh, but no, they weren't the only ones, after all. There was also the old woman in black, who was still praying to her beads. And Mr. Farival was also up for some reason. Edna approached one of Madame Lebrun's servants, who was cleaning the front porch of the house, and asked her to tell Robert that she was going to church. If he wanted to join her, he would have to come right away, for the boat would be leaving soon. Moments later, he was downstairs, ready to go. Although she had never come looking for him before, Edna did not have the feeling that she was doing something strange or surprising. Robert, too, did not seem to feel this way either. However, his face had a smile that seemed more confident and pleased than ever before. The Lebrun servants cooked them a quick breakfast with coffee. The two of them stood outside on the porch and ate what was given to them. Edna commented that the food was delicious and that she had not even thought of eating that morning. Robert replied that she never seemed to plan things very well. "I thought of getting you up to go to church, didn't I? My goodness, you sound like my husband. He always says, 'Why do I have to do all the thinking in this house?' Of course, I always seem to put him in a bad mood." They crossed the sandy beach to where the boat was waiting. There, sitting aboard, were the lovers, the woman in black, Mr. Farival, and a young Spanish woman holding a basket. Robert was familiar with her and had a brief conversation with her in Spanish on the way to the church. She was called Mariquita. She was a small woman with a pretty face and dark eyes. Her feet were rather rough, but she made no attempt to cover them. The driver of the boat, Baudelaire, acted as though he did not like it that Mariquita was on his boat. In reality, he was upset because Mr. Farival believed he was a better driver than him. However, it was easier to treat Mariquita badly, so he chose to fight with her. She would often just sit and give Robert a helpless look. However, other times, she would say something in Spanish under her breath and give Mr. Baudelaire an angry look. The lovers did not pay attention to anyone else. They just looked into one another's eyes. the woman in black was still praying as usual. And Mr. Farival went on and on about how he would handle the boat differently from the way Mr. Beaudelet was handling it. All this time, Edna could not take her eyes off of Mariquita. The Spanish woman asked Robert why the woman was looking at her in this way.
"I suppose that she finds you attractive,"
he answered.
"Do you want me to find out?"
"Don't bother. Are you two boyfriend and girlfriend?"
"No. She's got a husband and 2 boys.
"Well, that means nothing. Don't you know that Francisco carried away Silvano's woman? And they used his boat to get away, too."
"Oh, stop."
"Can she speak Spanish?"
"No."
"What about them over there, ignoring everyone else? Do you think they are husband and wife?"
"No way."
"Exactly. No way." The day was beginning to grow hotter. Edna felt her body absorbing the heat, while the wind cooled her skin. Robert opened his umbrella over her in order to block the light. While they were sailing, a large wind suddenly caught hold of the boat and prevented it from moving forward for a short while. Mr. Farival laughed at this, and Mr. Beaudelet quietly said angry words to himself about his troublesome passenger. Edna felt freer than ever before. It was as if she could keep sailing to wherever in the world she wanted to go. Robert talked to her without stopping. He no longer even noticed the Spanish woman, who was carrying shrimp in her basket and talking angrily to herself.
"I've got an idea. Why don't we head over to Grande Terre tomorrow?"
he suggested. "What's there? What can we do?"
"There's an old castle there that we can walk on. It has a great view up there."
The idea sounded wonderful to her. She imagined herself with Robert, walking among the castle ruins, seeing the snakes crawl about the land. Robert continued to say,
"And after that, we can take a boat to the Bayou Brulot.
"And what's there?"
We can go fishing."
"I'd rather stay at the Grande Terre. Let's not bother the fish."
"It's entirely up to you. I'll have my boat repaired. Then we can go sailing on our own. Perhaps while we're out on the sea, your ghost will speak to you again and tell you where the secret treasure is hidden on one of the islands out there."
"We'd be wealthy, but I wouldn't know what to do with so much money. I think I'd probably just hand it all over to you to use. Stolen money is not meant to be saved, but to be thrown about here and there, just for the beauty of it."
"No, it would be ours to spend together,"
he said, his face turning bright red. When they finally arrived at the church, everyone except for Beaudelet got out of the boat and went inside for the morning service. Meanwhile, Mariquita kept an angry eye on Robert. Chapter 13. The church service made Edna begin to feel sleepy. She could not concentrate on what the priest was saying, and her eyes kept closing. Normally, she would have tried her best to pay attention, but this morning, all she wanted was to get back outside into the fresh air. Finally, she stood up and walked out. Monsieur Farival, surprised to see her go, also rose to his feet to follow her and see what was wrong. However, seeing that Robert went after her, he decided to sit back down again. He made a comment to the woman in black, but she ignored him and never took her eyes from the songbook she held in her hands. "I'm sorry," Edna apologized. "I just couldn't stay in there any longer." They stood in the shade provided by the church. Robert looked at her with worried eyes.
"It wasn't a good idea to have come. Why don't we go over to Madame Antoine's? You can take a moment to relax there,"
he said, leading her gently away from the church. They came to a very peaceful place, where only the sound of the wind moving through the plants could be heard. Edna felt that the people who lived in the little houses of this island, surrounded by orange trees, must be the luckiest people in the world. They rested for a moment at a nearby fence and asked a young worker for some drinking water. Edna took a drink and then poured the rest of the water onto her face. It felt very refreshing. Madame Antoine's house was the last one in the village. She greeted Edna and Robert as though they were old friends. She could not speak English, but after Robert explained to her in French that Edna was feeling bad, Madame Antoine did everything she could to provide Edna some relief. She was a very big woman. Her movements were very slow and not at all smooth. However, she managed to keep her home extremely clean. Her bed looked like the most comfortable one Edna had ever seen. The view from the bedroom window was of the backyard, where an old boat that could no longer be used sat. Madame Antoine's son, Tony, was at church at the moment. Robert decided to have a smoke outside and wait for him to return, while Edna rested. Madame Antoine busied herself preparing food for the later meals of the day. Edna was in the room by herself now. She took off much of her outer clothing and then removed her shoes and socks. After splashing some cool water on her face, she then laid down on the large white bed. All around her was the smell of the countryside. It made her feel very comfortable. She ran her finger gently along her arms and legs and took notice of the shape of her body while doing so. Then, putting her arms behind her head, she fell asleep. While she slept, she could still hear everything that was going on around her. She heard Madame Antoine working in the kitchen. The sound of chickens walking about outside her window was also quite clear. And mixed with the gentle hum of the wind were the voices of Robert and Tony, speaking French. Edna's French was quite poor, so it was difficult for her to understand what they were talking about. No matter what she heard, everything added to her feeling of relaxation. Edna woke up feeling that she had slept for a long time. Everything was quiet now. Madame Antoine was no longer in her kitchen, and the chickens seemed to have gone somewhere else as well. When she looked out the window, she saw Robert sitting alone next to the boat, reading a book. Above her, she saw that the mosquito net had been pulled over her. The position of the sun in the sky indicated that it must have been late afternoon. Seeing that Madame Antoine had put out some towels and powder for Edna, she got up and cleaned her face and arms at the sink in the corner of the room. She then powdered her nose and looked at herself in the mirror for a while. She now looked healthy and full of energy. She felt great. In the next room, she found some wine next to a plate with a cover on it. Underneath the cover was some bread. Edna ate some of it and had a bit of wine as well. Once she felt satisfied, she walked outside, pulled an orange from a nearby tree in the yard, and tossed it over to Robert, who was surprised to see her out of bed. Robert looked up, and his whole face lit up with joy at seeing Edna. He got up immediately and joined her under the orange tree. "What year is it? I feel as though I slept for 100 years," she said, laughing. "It seems like you and I are the only humans left on the planet. Tell me, when did everyone disappear? Madame Antoine, Tony, everyone at Grand Isle?" Fixing a part of her clothing for her, Robert joked along with her, saying,
"You're right. It has been exactly 100 years. I've been protecting you all this time, sitting here, reading this book. I'm afraid, however, that I was unable to keep your dinner from going bad."
"I don't care how bad it is now. I'll eat it anyway. I'm starving." As they walked back to the kitchen, Edna asked, "Really, though, where is everyone?"
"They left a long time ago. They decided not to disturb your rest. I, of course, wouldn't have let them if they'd tried."
"I hope that my husband doesn't get angry," Edna said.
"Why should he? You're safe with me,"
Robert said, gathering all of the dishes that had been left out for them.
"Madame Antoine and Tony are at the afternoon church service. Tony told me that I could use his boat to take you back to Grand Isle whenever we're ready."
He began to cook everything again. Madame Antoine had actually prepared very little food. It had been Robert who had gathered everything. He felt proud, once everything was finished, to see Mrs. Pontellier eat so much. "Well, I suppose that we ought to get going," Edna said, after finishing the last of her meal.
"It's not very late, actually,"
he replied. "Oh, but in a couple of hours it'll be sunset."
"So what? Who cares about the sun?"
They remained under the orange tree until Madame Antoine returned from church. When she arrived, she seemed tired and out of breath. Her son, Tony, had decided to wait at the church until Edna left. He was still afraid of women. Edna liked sitting there in the yard, under the tree, watching the sun change everything to gold. The shadows slowly moved across the yard. Robert lay next to her on the grass and played with the edges of her shirt. Madame Antoine sat down in a chair at the front of her house. She was in the mood for telling stories. She talked about how she had left the island only 2 times in her whole lifetime. Robert and Edna enjoyed hearing about her past and were surprised when they soon found that it was nighttime. Mrs. Pontellier could hear ghosts whispering in the wind. All around them, as they went aboard Tony's boat, spirits sailed their old ships among the plants that grew along the shore. Chapter 14. Madame Ratignolle informed Edna that her younger son, Etienne, had been very bad while she was away. When the time had come for him to go to bed, he refused and started to yell very loudly. At that point, Madame Ratignolle tried to calm him down as best she could. She had had no problems with the other boy, Raoul. He had gone to bed 2 hours ago. Etienne was dressed in his sleeping clothes, which were too long for him and caused him to almost fall several times as Edna walked him to his bedroom. His eyes were red and swollen from crying so long. In his room, his mother picked him up and held him in her arms as she sat in a chair. She sang a few simple songs to him until he fell asleep. Then she put him to bed. It was just after 9 o'clock and still rather early for the adults. Edna sat with Madame Ratignolle and chatted for a short while. Léonce was quite worried, Madame Ratignolle explained. He was ready to take a boat to the island to get you, but Mr. Farival explained to him that you were simply very tired and needed to rest for a while. Finally, hearing that Tony was to bring you back to Grand Isle, your husband calmed down and decided to wait here for you. He's gone over to the club to meet a gentleman about some business. I don't remember exactly what it was about. Anyway, I can't stay here with you now because my husband is waiting for me at home and he just hates it when I'm not there with him. After Adele had left, Robert, who had been there the whole time, went with Edna to pull the mosquito net over Etienne. Do you realize that we've been hanging out together since very early this morning? Edna commented.
Well, we can't really count the time when you were sleeping, can we?
Answered Robert. He then took her hand for a moment, squeezed it in order to say goodbye, and then walked alone towards the sea. Edna was not at all tired. She decided to wait up for her husband. Despite hearing the sounds of people having a good time over at Madame Lebrun's, she did not join them. She wanted to be alone for a while. She sat on the front porch thinking about this year's summer holiday and how it compared to other summers. In the end, she decided that it was something about herself that was different. Something had changed inside of her. She thought it strange that Robert had gone to the sea by himself. She would not have minded if he had stayed a little longer with her. Soon, she was softly singing to herself a little song that Robert had been singing as they were returning from Madame Antoine's. She thought his voice was quite nice and could not stop hearing it in her head. Chapter 15. One night, when Edna came into the dining hall, she found that some of the people were talking quite loudly and excitedly. It was Victor, Madame Lebrun's younger son. She joined the people at her usual table and sat down next to her friend Adele. She was just about to begin eating when several people at once told her that Robert was leaving for Mexico. She immediately lost her desire to eat and put her spoon down noisily on her plate. Robert had spent all that morning with her and had never once talked about Mexico. He had gone to his mother's in the afternoon, which was quite normal. Although it was true that Edna had found it a little strange that he did not go to the beach with her before dinner. She could not believe her ears. She noticed that he was looking at her from across the table at that moment. He was trying to smile at her, but it was obvious that he felt uncomfortable. She turned to her neighbors and asked them when he planned to go. "He's leaving this evening." "Can you believe it?" they answered. "I don't believe it, actually. No one just decides so suddenly to leave the country as though they were going to take a walk to the beach or get a beer down the street."
"It's not so sudden. All of you have heard me talking about going there for many years,"
Robert shouted. Madame Lebrun struck her drinking glass with her fork to get everyone's attention. "Please, everyone be quiet for a moment. Listen to Robert's reasons for going so soon. You be quiet, Victor. I often dream that one day you might lose your ability to speak."
"Yes, I'm sure, Mother. It would give you that much more opportunity to talk yourself,"
Victor replied in an angry voice.
"You, young man, are an ass,"
Mr. Farival shouted at Victor.
"And you, old man, are not much better yourself,"
returned Victor.
"Shut your mouth, you idiot,"
Robert yelled at his brother.
"Show some respect."
The table then became very quiet, and Robert began to explain his reasons for leaving. It seemed that he was meeting a friend of the family there. In order to catch the larger boat the following morning, he would have to leave for New Orleans with Baudelaire that evening.
"Yes, but when did you decide to go?"
asked Mr. Farival.
"I decided today,"
Robert answered, obviously bothered by the question.
"May I ask when exactly you decided today?"
Mr. Farival continued to ask.
"I guess it was around 4 o'clock, sir."
Edna sat quietly, making herself eat the food before her. The lovers were lost in their own unrelated conversation at another end of the table. The woman in black suddenly spoke for the first time. "I got this necklace in Mexico a long time ago. I pray to it every day, but I don't know if it's useful outside of Mexico. Could you ask one of the priests there about it?" Madame Ratignolle then warned Robert not to trust Mexican people. She said that every one of them was bad. She supported this information with a story about a Mexican man she had once known. He used to make and sell very delicious Mexican food near her home. She had always been friendly to him, and he was quite nice as well. Then, one day, she heard that he had been put in jail for killing his wife with a knife. Edna had no opinions at all about the Mexicans. She could not believe that everyone was going on and on about them. What was wrong with them? Robert is leaving tonight, and they're all talking nonsense. "When do you leave tonight?" she asked Robert.
"Not until 10. We'll need the moonlight to see where we're going,"
he answered. "Have you packed your bags and everything?"
"Oh, yes. I'm not taking much with me."
After he looked away to answer another person's question, Edna took the opportunity to get up from the table and leave the dining hall. She returned to her home and started cleaning in order to try and not think about Robert. She put away her clothing and changed into a more comfortable evening gown. She did her hair and then helped the nurse to put her sons to bed. As usual, the boys did not want to go to bed. Edna sent the nurse away and then began a story to help her sons fall asleep. Then a servant of Madame Lebrun came and asked Edna to join the Lebrun family at their home. They were going to have a little going-away gathering for Robert. She answered that she might come a little later. She had already gotten ready for bed. After the servant left, she went out on the porch and sat in a chair. She was very anxious and tried to cool herself off in the night air. Adele saw her there, looking quite upset. She came over to see what the matter was. "I guess I was just made nervous by all of the craziness at the dinner table this evening," Edna explained. "I just can't believe that Robert would make such a sudden decision and not have said anything to me today about it." "Yes, it was quite rude of him not to tell anyone, especially you. But you should go to the Lebruns. It doesn't look good you staying away like this. Come, let's go." "I'm not in the mood," Edna responded. "Oh, well, neither am I. Come on." "I'll stay here. They won't get angry as long as one of us goes." Madame Ratignolle then headed for the Lebruns. In truth, she was in the mood to go and hear more about Mexico. It was exciting for her. Not long after that, Robert came over to the Pontellier's cottage. He had his travel bag with him.
"Are you all right?"
he asked Edna. "I'm fine. Is it already time for you to go?" she answered. Lighting a cigarette, he told her that he still had 20 minutes before meeting Baudelaire. "So will you be there for a long time?" asked Edna.
"Possibly for the rest of my life,"
he answered.
"I'll have to see how I like it before I can know for sure."
"Supposing that you don't stay for the rest of your life, when do you think you might come back?"
"Who knows?"
"Well, I don't agree with the way you've handled this. It's ridiculous. Why did you not talk with me about it?" He did not answer her right away. There were first a few moments of quiet, and then he said,
"Let's not leave each other feeling angry. I've never seen you like this."
"I have no desire to separate in this way. However, you have not considered me at all in this decision of yours. We have spent a lot of time together this summer, and you just decide to remove yourself from my life. Just like that. In one day, you're gone. It's not a very nice thing to do to a person. I was looking forward to spending time with you in New Orleans later this year."
"I was too. That may be the reason. Well, goodbye. Well, goodbye,"
he said, interrupting himself.
"I hope that you might remember me."
She took hold of his hand and asked that he send her a letter from time to time, telling her how things were going in Mexico. He promised her that he would, and then immediately walked away toward the dock, where Baudelaire was preparing his boat for the journey. She tried to control herself, but the tears came anyway. At that moment, she realized the feelings that she had for Robert. It had been a long time since she had felt this way. She did not care about her past or her future. The present was all that mattered to her. She had become aware of her desire, and now the object of her desire was gone. She felt terribly empty and alone. Chapter 16. One morning, as Edna was walking to the beach, Miss Rice surprised her by approaching her with a direct question. "Do you miss that young friend of yours?" As the time for her to return to New Orleans quickly approached, Edna found herself spending more and more of her time swimming in the sea. It had become the only thing she really enjoyed doing. Miss Rice's question went straight to Edna's heart, for it was the only thing that she usually thought about. She had even begun to regularly visit Madame Lebrun's sewing room, so that she could talk about Robert and look through the family pictures. Unfortunately, most of the pictures of Robert were old. None of them looked quite like the man that she was so familiar with. Everyone knew that she missed him. Even her husband asked how her life had changed without having Robert around any longer. It did not make her feel strange to talk with him about Robert. She did not make any connection between her feelings for the two men. One day, Edna got into a bit of an argument with Adele. It was because she expressed the idea that she could give up nearly everything she had, even her life, for her children, but she could never live a false or unhappy life for them. Of course, Adele could not understand this kind of thinking at all. In her mind, the greatest thing a woman could ever do for her children was give up her life to die for them. Madame Rice's question did not come as a surprise to Edna. "Oh, yes, I do," she answered. "But his mother must have felt terrible to see him go." "Are you kidding?" asked Madame Rice in surprise. She didn't mind at all. Her favorite child is still living with her. She absolutely loves that idiot son of hers, Victor. I have no idea why. Robert's a good boy, but I can't imagine how he keeps himself from beating his brother to death. I can't see him ever doing anything to hurt Victor, said Edna. "Oh, well, you didn't see him a few years ago, when the two of them got into a terrible fight over that Spanish girl named Mariquita. A bad girl she is." Edna did not want to hear any more about this. It made her upset. She removed her robe and walked out into the water. She swam with more energy than ever. When she finished and walked back up onto the beach again, she found Miss Rice still there, looking out at the water. "When are you going back to the city?" she asked the pianist. "I'm leaving on Monday," she answered. "What about you?" "Not for another week yet. Did you enjoy your holiday?" "I suppose so. However, the insects and those two Farival twins just about made me crazy." Chapter 17. The Pontelliers had a nice home in New Orleans. It was very large and painted entirely in white, except for the windows, which were green. All around the home were plants and flowers of almost every kind that could be found in the state of Louisiana. The house was decorated in a very traditional way. all of the furniture had been chosen very carefully. Many of Mrs. Pontellier's female guests envied the fact that her husband was so willing to spend his money on making the home so nice and comfortable. They always complained that their husbands were cheap and did not care for the home as much. It was true, actually, that Mr. Pontellier cared very much for his home. He loved to walk around the house and look at all of the things that he could say were his own. He felt proud of having so much. In the afternoon, every Tuesday, Mrs. Pontellier opened her doors to anyone who might want to visit her. People came either by carriage or car, and sometimes, if the weather was nice enough, they even walked to her home. The Pontelliers had a young, black servant boy greet the guests at the door and take their cards. Once they entered the home, another servant would be there to offer them food and drink. For the 6 years she had been married, Edna kept the same schedule. On other days of the week, she and her husband would go to the theater to see a play or hear some music. They would leave the house at around 7 o'clock in the evenings because Mr. Pontellier never returned home from work earlier than 6 or 6:30. Not long after they had returned to the city, the Pontellier couple found themselves in their home without any guests on a Tuesday evening. Mr. Pontellier noticed that his wife had not even bothered to wear her usual Tuesday dress. She was wearing clothing that was not at all special. While accepting a bowl of soup from one of his servants, Mr. Pontellier asked his wife how her day had been.
"Did a lot of people come to see you?"
he asked. "Yes, it seems that quite a lot of people did come by. At least, that's what the servants told me. I wasn't here all day," she answered while tasting her soup.
"You weren't here? But it's Tuesday. What did you leave the house for?"
"I just wanted to, so I did."
"You must have left a note for everyone who came by, telling them the reason you were not there."
"No, I just had our servant boy tell them I was not at home today. That was all," she said, without seeming to care.
"But you can't do such things, honey. You and I are a part of the highest society. We are expected to entertain guests every week. If for some reason we can't do that, it is our responsibility to let people know why."
Mr. Pontellier explained, with a look of surprise on his face.
"Ah, the soup tastes terrible. Why can't our cook make something delicious? Don't we pay her enough? I swear, you can get better food in the poor areas of town."
Mrs. Pontellier then asked the servant boy to bring the cards of the people who had come to the house that day. When he returned with them, she asked him to show them to her husband. Mr. Pontellier took the cards from the boy and asked that the soup be taken away. Once the boy was gone, he began to read the names of the people aloud.
"Oh, the 2 Dalacida girls came over. I do a lot of business with their father. Pretty little girls, actually. Ah, and Mrs. Belthrop, too. She's an important one, dear. Her husband helps me to make quite a lot of money every year. Maybe you should send her a letter to apologize or something.
He read several other names and made the same kinds of comments about each one. All this time, Edna had been getting increasingly angry. Goodness! Why are these cards so important to you?
I know that it's a small thing, but we need to be nice to these people. It could cause problems for us later on if we're not.
Mr. Pontellier ended up being unsatisfied with the entire meal. The fish had been cooked too long, and he disagreed with the way the vegetables had been put on the tray.
What is wrong with our cook? Are we actually expected to eat this?
Edna, who thought the food was fine, only said, "Up until now, you've always loved our cook."
Well, I suppose she is just like everyone else and needs to be watched a little more carefully. You know, I have to keep a close eye on my workers at the office. If I didn't, they'd all get lazy and the business would just fall apart.
He then stood up without having actually tasted anything but the soup. "What are you doing?" asked Edna.
If I can't get something to eat here, I guess that I'll just have to go to the club to have dinner. Have a good evening.
He then walked into the hallway and out the front door without saying another word. This was not the first time that Mr. Pontellier had walked out during dinner. It always upset Edna and made her feel guilty. She was a housewife. It was her responsibility to make sure that the servants were doing their jobs. One time she felt so bad that she spent the entire week studying cookbooks and planning every meal very carefully in order to make sure Mr. Pontellier would be happy. This night, however, a different feeling came over her. She felt angry. She went to her bedroom and told her servants to tell anyone who came by the house that she was not available. In her room, Edna stood by the window and looked out into the darkness that hid all of her plants and flowers from view. She listened to the sounds coming from outside and felt as though all of the spirits were gathering about her and speaking to her. But the things she heard did not make her feel better. The spirits sounded sad and hopeless. Turning away from the window, she then walked about the large room, tearing a piece of cloth that she had been carrying around with her. At one point, she took off her wedding ring, threw it on the ground, and tried to destroy it under her foot. The ring, however, looked untouched afterward. No damage had been done at all. Not satisfied, she grabbed a vase of flowers and threw it across the room. It broke into hundreds of pieces against the fireplace. That helped her to feel a little better. One of the servants, after hearing the glass break, knocked at the bedroom door. "It's all right," Edna shouted. "I just dropped something. Wait until tomorrow to clean it." The door opened a little and the concerned face of a servant appeared from around it.
"I can't leave it there all night, ma'am. You or Mr. Pontellier might hurt yourself. Oh, and here's your ring. It was underneath the table there."
Mrs. Pontellier took the ring from the servant and placed it back on her finger. Chapter 18. The next day, Mr. Pontellier wanted his wife to meet him in the afternoon at a store in order to buy some new shelves for their library. Edna refused to come, for she did not feel that they needed new shelves. "Why don't you try saving some money instead of always spending it?" she suggested, a little angrily.
You should know by now that people don't get rich by saving money. They get rich by making it.
He felt disappointed that she did not plan to go with him. However, there was no time to think much about this. He had to leave for work. He gave his wife a kiss, told her she was looking a little unhealthy and should get some exercise, and then headed for his office. Edna went out on the front porch and stood for a short time. Her 2 children were playing in the yard. Their nurse followed them close behind and pretended to be having as much fun as they were. Edna then pulled a few flowers from the vine that grew along the wall of the porch and put them in her pocket without thinking. Her face looked empty. She cared very little about what was going on around her, and suddenly felt like she did not belong to this world. She went back inside and took a look at some of the pictures she had drawn in the past. The mistakes were obvious to her. She began to try and improve one of them, but soon found that she was not in the mood. She then chose several of the worst pictures and, after showering and dressing for the day, took them with her out of the house. She began to think about Robert. Many times she had tried to forget about him, but he would always eventually return to her thoughts. She could not prevent it. And it was interesting that her thoughts were not memories of certain things the 2 of them had done together. Her thoughts were simply about him. He was somewhere out there in the world. He existed. And that was enough to make her constantly think about him. It was Madame Ratignolle's home that Edna was walking toward with her paintings under her arm. Their friendship had remained as strong in the city as it had been at Grand Isle. Her home was not far from the Pontelliers. Mr. Ratignole owned and operated a small drugstore that was located on the ground floor of their apartment building. He had an excellent reputation as an honest and hard-working businessman. Edna found her friend putting away her recently washed clothing. As soon as she saw Edna arrive, she stopped what she was doing. "Oh, now just one moment," she said. "Let me give the servants some things to do first." After giving her servants a list of things to do, Adele took Edna's hand and pulled her to a comfortable room at the front of the house. Madame Ratignole's beauty seemed even greater than before. The gown that she wore fit her body very well and left a lot of her skin uncovered. "You know, one day I'd really love to draw you. I've been thinking about taking some drawing lessons lately. I brought a few old things I'd done before. Have a look at them. What do you think? Should I continue to study, or should I give it up?" Edna was well aware that Adele knew almost nothing about drawing, but she wanted to hear some words of encouragement from her friend. She needed to hear them. Madame Ratignole took the pictures from Edna and looked them over carefully. "Oh, these are wonderful. Why, I feel like I could reach into the picture and pick up one of those pieces of fruit in it. It's so real. You really shouldn't give it up, Edna." Her friend's praise did not make Edna feel any better. She kept a few of the pictures and gave the rest to Adele as a gift. When Mr. Ratignolle came into the house a little while later, his wife proudly showed him the pictures Edna had given them. He smiled and thanked Mrs. Pontellier. He was a very friendly man. The three of them sat down to have lunch in the dining room. Mr. Ratignolle thought that Edna was looking a little unhealthy and suggested she take some of his medicine. He then chatted with the women about all sorts of things. His wife listened with great interest and laughed at all of his jokes. When the food was served, Edna found that it was excellently prepared and tasted delicious. When she left them, Edna could not help feeling sad. The Ratignolles were certainly happier than the Pontelliers, but their happiness seemed empty and false to her. She felt that her friend Adele would never get to experience life as it really was meant to be experienced. She was too well protected from the world, from troubles, from the things that make life interesting. Chapter 19. Edna eventually realized how stupid she had been to break the glass vase and try to destroy her wedding ring. That kind of thing would not improve her situation. From now on, she had decided to simply live the way she wanted to live. Tuesdays were no longer visiting days for her, and if anyone came to see her, she did not go and see them in return. She no longer cared about the rules of society. They meant nothing to her. Mr. Pontellier could not believe his wife's behavior. After a while, seeing that she meant to do absolutely nothing for the home, his surprise quickly turned to anger. When he would say something to her about it, she would fight back.
"How can you just let the house go like this?"
he said.
"It's your responsibility to keep it in good condition and to look after the servants. Instead, all you do is paint."
"But I want to paint."
"I'm not trying to prevent you from painting, but you can't just forget about your other responsibilities. You can't just forget about your husband and children, who need you to manage the house. Your friend, Madame Ratignolli, practices the piano without making the rest of the house suffer."
"I haven't stopped managing the house because of my painting. I have other reasons."
"Well, what are they?"
"Oh, just forget it. Go away. I don't feel like talking now." On these occasions, Mr. Pontellier began to think that his wife might be going crazy. Something was clearly wrong with her, but he could not say what. She was a changed woman, but he could not understand that she was changing into who she really was. She was no longer pretending to be a stranger to herself. Edna continued to paint for many hours every day. She soon had everyone in her house sitting for her up in the attic, where she now spent most of her time. She painted her boys several times, until they no longer thought it was fun or interesting. Then she began to paint the servants and the nurse. As she painted, she would often sing the song that Robert used to sing while they walked on the beach. It reminded her of the summer. She could see the beach, the islands, and the moon at night. and she could hear the water. Some days she would feel very happy, without knowing what it was that made her happy. On those days she liked to wander around outside and dream. On those days she was able to paint quite well. Other days, however, were unhappy ones. On those days she could do very little. On those days nothing seemed worth doing, not even living. Chapter 20. One day, when Edna was feeling quite unhappy, she decided to pay Miss Rice a visit. Even though their last meeting was not a very pleasant one, she still wished to hear the woman play the piano. However, when she went to get the woman's card, she found that it was missing. She then decided to try and find Miss Rice's address in the city directory. But when she went to the home, she discovered that the woman had moved 6 months before. Edna asked the store owner next door if he knew Miss Rice's new address. He, however, knew nothing, and could only talk about how happy he was that the woman was no longer in the neighborhood. Then Edna realized that the best person to get the address from would be Madame Lebrun. It was November, so she knew that the Lebruns would have returned to New Orleans. She knew the address and went there immediately. Victor answered the door and happily greeted her. He was surprised to see her and made no attempt to hide it. Apparently, his relationship with the servants was not a very good one, for when he told the black woman behind him to inform his mother that she had a guest, the servant refused to go. He then shouted many terrible words at the woman and scared her into doing what she was told. Edna then sat down on the front porch. It was a nice day outside, and because she was tired, she wanted to sit and relax in the sunlight for a while. Victor sat down in a chair next to hers and explained that he was only in town for a couple of days. Usually, he spent the winters at Grand Isle, taking care of the house, getting things ready for the next summer.
I come to the city to give myself a break. Phew, you wouldn't believe the night I had. What a time!
He then spent the next few minutes telling Mrs. Pontellier about a girl he had met. It was obvious that he had been successful with her. He probably would have described their whole night together in great detail. But soon, Madame Lebrun came out and joined them on the porch. "Why, Mrs. Pontellier, what a wonderful surprise! Please come inside. How's your family? You should visit us more often," she said in her usual friendly way. Instead of going inside, they all stayed on the porch. Victor moved to a couch and laid down on it, where he could easily look at Edna's face. "We've hardly heard from our Robert," Madame Lebrun went on. "He's only written us twice. Victor, could you get those letters for me?"
Why? They're very uninteresting. I can tell you everything he wrote in them now,"
he answered. Victor was right. The letters said almost nothing. He talked a little about Mexico City and the city of Vera Cruz. It seemed that there would be plenty of opportunities for him to make money there, but nothing had happened yet. He sent some money to Madame Lebrun and asked that she say hello to all of his friends. And that was all. Edna's sadness suddenly came back to her, and she remembered her desire to see Miss Rice. Madame Lebrun, of course, knew the address and gave it to Edna, but hoped that she might stay and join them for dinner, since it was already so late in the afternoon. Edna kindly refused the invitation and then got up to go. Victor walked with her out to the sidewalk and reminded her not to share with anyone else the story of his adventures the other night. She made a joke of it and laughed. Later, when Victor returned to the porch, Madame Lebrun commented on how good Mrs. Pontellier looked.
"Yes, she looks incredible,"
he answered.
"She's almost like a different woman."
Chapter 21. When Edna came to Miss Rice's, she found the woman repairing a pair of boots next to one of the many large windows she had throughout her apartment. She was still wearing the same clothing she had worn at Grand Isle. "I thought you would never come. I thought you were just like all those false women who say things they don't mean," Miss Rice said, stopping her work. "Were you hoping I would come?" asked Edna. "I'm happy to see you, yes. I guessed that you didn't like me very much." "Well, to be honest, I don't really know how I feel about you," Edna replied. Miss Rice appreciated this kind of honesty. "You know what? I'm going to get you a cup of coffee," she said. "Please, have a seat." And then she went over to the stove and brought back 2 hot cups of black coffee. "I received a letter from Robert," Miss Rice suddenly said. "He sent you a letter?" Edna asked in surprise as she took a small drink of her coffee. "Yes. Is that so surprising? I have to admit, however, he only wrote about you the whole time." "Oh, please, can I read it?" asked Edna, suddenly excited. "But it was written to me, for my eyes only." "Yes, but you just told me that the whole thing is about me." "Oh, yes. Mrs. Pontellier this, Mrs. Pontellier that. He asked me to play his favorite piano piece for you. He wants me to write him back and tell him how you liked it." "Can't I read it?" "No, sorry." "Well, then why don't you play the song he likes for me?" "It's starting to get late. Shouldn't you be getting back to your home?" "That's not important. Play for me, please." "But what have you been doing lately?" "Nothing much. Mostly drawing. I'm trying to become an artist, I guess." Miss Rice laughed. Artists must have natural talent, and they must be extremely brave. They have to take risks. It's impossible for them to live normal lives. "Let me read the letter and play for me. I won't give up." "Ah, you really are stubborn," Miss Rice said, laughing. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to Edna and then walked over to her piano. As Edna read, Miss Rice played Robert's favorite song. The music and the letter made Edna cry. When the song was over, she rose from her chair and walked toward the door. Before walking through it, she turned around and asked if she could visit Miss Rice again. "Of course, whenever you like." Chapter 22. One morning, Mr. Pontellier went to visit the family doctor, Dr. Mandelet, who was almost fully retired now and mostly just gave advice to his patients. He had a good reputation as a doctor, and many people came to him for help. The only people he would actually be a doctor for were his closest friends. Mr. Pontellier had known the doctor for many years now and was considered a friend.
"Don't tell me you are ill, Pontellier. Please, come in and sit a while,"
the doctor said, looking at his guest with his little blue eyes. He was a bit fat and had disorderly white hair.
"No, I'm feeling just fine. It's my wife that I've come to talk with you about. Something's wrong with her, and I'm not sure what it is,"
Mr. Pontellier answered.
"Edna? Ill? But I just saw her maybe a week before, and she looked perfectly fine,"
Dr. Mandelet said in surprise.
"It's nothing to do with her health, actually. She's just been acting strange lately. I can't understand why. She doesn't care about the house at all. She just lets it go,"
Mr. Pontellier said anxiously.
"It's normal, Pontellier. Not all women are the same. Not all of them would like to be a housewife."
Dr. Mandelet laughed.
"I understand that, but the problem is the way she does things. I don't want to fight with her all the time, but she makes me so angry that I can't control myself any more. It seems like the idea of women's rights has been growing in her more and more." "Has she made friends with any of those highly intelligent women I've been hearing about lately? My wife sometimes talks about them." "That's what's so strange. She's not spending time with anyone, really. She's almost always alone, walking the streets with a sad look on her face. She's been coming home late in the evenings, too. She's not had any of her Tuesday afternoon receptions for a long time. I just can't understand it. I'm seriously concerned. I think something is terribly wrong,"
he said, getting increasingly upset.
"Is anybody in her family this way, too?" "No, absolutely not. They are all good people. They all live in Kentucky and run a horse farm. Some of the most beautiful land I've ever seen. Her youngest sister is getting married in a couple of weeks." "Is Edna going to attend?" "I think that she should. It would make her feel better to spend time with her family for a while." "She refuses to go. She says that weddings are too depressing. Can you believe that she says such a thing to her husband?" "I think, Pontellier, that you ought to just let things continue as they are for a while. She's experiencing some kind of emotional problem deep inside of herself, and she's trying to deal with it. If you interfere too often, it will only make things worse, and it will take her a much longer time to get better. It's not possible for you or I to understand what she's experiencing. We just have to be patient. Invite me over for dinner soon. I can have a look at her then, as a friend." "Oh, that would be great. How's Thursday?" "That should be fine, as long as my wife hasn't planned anything for that evening." "Oh, there's one more thing, Doctor. I'm going on a business trip to New York soon. Do you think I should take Edna with me?"
asked Mr. Pontellier.
"It's up to her. Don't force her to go."
Mr. Pontellier thanked the doctor and then left. Throughout the entire conversation, the doctor had wanted to ask if Edna had a lover, but he knew that Creole men were very jealous people, so he decided not to say anything. Chapter 23. Edna's father came to New Orleans for several days in order to buy a wedding present for his daughter and to purchase a nice suit for himself. Although he and Edna were not very close, they enjoyed one another's company. And Edna liked having a visitor in the house. It was a nice change. Soon after Edna's father arrived, she led him to her painting room and asked him to model for her. He sat down in a chair and sat up very straight, looking very much like the military man that he had been years before. One night, Edna took her father to a musical party being held at the Ratignolles' home. Mr. Pontellier did not go along because he thought such parties were only for artists. He went to the men's club instead. Edna's father was treated as the most important guest at the party. Madame Ratignolles acted as though she found the old man very attractive. She spoke to him often and praised him in all sorts of ways. By the end of the night, Edna's father felt like a young man again. Edna could not behave in the same way as Adele toward men. She found a couple of the men at the party attractive. After talking with them during a break in the music, she found that they were quite nice and interesting. However, she never once thought to behave like a young girl toward them in order to make them want her. Edna found her father interesting, and for the first time in her life, she felt something almost like closeness to him. And yet, closeness was probably not the correct word. They did not share any of their deepest feelings with one another, but she did feel that she understood a little more about him than she had ever before. She said nothing to him about her problems with her husband. She spent most of the time providing her father with whatever it was he wanted or needed. Usually, this meant serving him drinks. She thought it was kind of fun to serve him. On Thursday, when Dr. Mandelet joined them for dinner, he could not see any of the sadness that Mr. Pontellier had talked about in his office. She seemed very excited and full of energy. She had taken her father to the horse racing track earlier that day. The two of them continued to talk about it throughout the meal. After observing her for a while, however, the doctor did find Edna to be different from before. He felt that it was a positive change. She seemed to be more alive. She seemed happier. A small argument arose between Edna's father and Mr. Pontellier because Pontellier did not like horse racing. Edna supported her father's arguments and seemed to enjoy doing so. After a while, things calmed down, and people began to tell stories about their past or things that they had heard. Edna's story was about a woman who ran away with her lover one night by boat and was never seen or heard from again. It was not a true story. She had totally made it up on her own. However, she lied and told the men at the table that she had heard it from Madame Antoine. Everyone felt that her story sounded very real and beautiful. She told it well and with emotion. Later that night, when the doctor left the Pontellier home, he found himself regretting that he had come. He felt that he was too old to be going out, and he did not like learning about people's secrets. He whispered to himself as he got into his taxi,
"Let's just hope that it's not a man that I know."
Chapter 24. Edna's father got angry when he heard that Edna was unwilling to attend her sister's wedding. Mr. Pontellier, taking the advice of Dr. Mandelet, stayed out of the argument entirely. Edna's father was disappointed with her, as he could not persuade her to go with him. He could not imagine what Janet's reaction would be, and he was sure that Margaret would never forgive her. Edna was happy to see her father go. Mr. Pontellier left soon afterward as well. He went to the wedding and gave the newly married couple a large amount of money, hoping to make up for his wife's absence.
"You're not strong enough with her, Léonce,"
Edna's father said at the wedding.
"You must show women that you are the boss. Don't let them get away with such behavior. That is the only way to deal with them, believe me."
Mr. Pontellier did not respond, although he did sense that Edna's father's strict treatment of his own wife had eventually caused her death. Surprisingly, Edna was not as happy to see her husband go. He would be away for quite a long while. She found herself remembering all of his kindness and devotion all of a sudden. She helped him to pack and told him to be careful while he was away. She even cried as he left and told him that she would be very sad and lonely without him, and that she would probably end up joining him in New York. But after he was gone, Edna's feelings were quite different from what she expected. She felt a sense of calm and freedom. Even the kids were not around. Her mother-in-law had taken them to her country home, hoping that they might learn to appreciate life away from the city. She walked around her home as though it were her first time being there. She worked in the garden, pulling up the grass that had grown around her flowers. Her neighbor's little dog came and started to play with her as she worked. That evening she sat down by herself to a wonderful dinner and a glass of excellent-tasting wine. Everything seemed to be just perfect. Afterward, she went into the library and read part of a book until she grew too sleepy to continue. Then, following a nice bath, she got into bed under the warmth of the sheets and enjoyed a feeling of relaxation unlike any she had ever felt before. Chapter 25. Edna found that she could only work well on sunny days. She understood now that her intention was not to master the art of painting. She simply enjoyed the act of painting, nothing more. So she let herself make mistakes and did not get upset when something did not turn out as she had hoped. When it was not sunny, she would either visit friends she had met at Grand Isle, or she would stay at home and spend the day thinking. Her thoughts on these days made her uncomfortable. It gave her the feeling that, as time continued to pass, she was missing opportunities. Other times she had more positive thoughts. She believed that, because she was still so young, there would be plenty of time to make her life better. One day, Alcée Arobin and Mrs. Highcamp, two people she had met at the horse racing track with her father, invited her to accompany them to the races. Mrs. James Highcamp was a woman in her 40s who used her pretty young daughter to attract fashionable young men. Alcée Arobin was an example of this. He was quite popular in society and could often be seen at the races, the theater, and the most expensive clubs. He was a charming fellow who was quiet, yet easy to talk with. He dressed as any man of society might be expected to dress. It had actually been Alcée Arobin's idea to invite Mrs. Pontellier to come to the races. Ever since he had talked with her at the track with her father, he had a very high opinion of Edna. Edna knew everything about horse racing. Having grown up on a farm in Kentucky, she was very familiar with horses. She always bet a lot of money and would almost always win. People all around her watched her carefully, trying to find out which horse she thought was the best to bet on. Seeing her so knowledgeable and sure of herself made Arobin even more attracted to her. Later on, they had a dinner with the Highcamp family. It was not very fun. Mr. and Mrs. Highcamp were very quiet and serious people. Their daughter played piano for Edna and Alcée. However, it was performed just like a Highcamp would be expected to play it, unemotionally. Arobin gave her a ride back home late in the evening. He made a very weak attempt to come into her home by asking for some matches from her. They talked for a short time inside, and then, after promising to take her again to the races, the young man left. He kept his promise and came by a few days later. He was alone this time. When asked about Mrs. Highcamp, he lied and said that they were supposed to pick her up on the way to the track. Of course, the truth was that he had never mentioned going to the track to Mrs. Highcamp. When they went to the Highcamp home, no one was there. Arobin pretended to be disappointed. Edna suggested going to the track anyway. It was a very interesting afternoon. Edna became excited again. Arobin was a very easygoing person. The two of them became closer and closer until soon they were sharing more personal information with one another. That evening they talked over dinner at Edna's. As he was about to leave, Arobin told Edna how much he wished that they could have met at a younger age. He told her how bad he was when he was young, and, walking up close to her, raised the sleeve of his shirt to show the mark left by a knife on his arm. It was from a fight when he was 19. She gently touched the mark and, without knowing what she was doing, took hold of his hand. She then realized what she had done and quickly walked away from him. "Seeing such marks always makes me feel ill," she said.
"Sorry, Edna. I didn't realize it was so disgusting,"
he said, walking after her. Then, taking her hand in his, he told her,
"Good night."
However, he did not leave. Instead, he kept looking into her eyes.
"When shall we go to the races again?"
"I haven't time for the races. I must paint," she answered, trying to sound cold.
"Oh, yes. You were going to show me your work. Can I come by tomorrow to have a look?"
he asked. "No, you said goodbye to me. Why haven't you gone? God, I can't stand you," she said, aware of the falseness in her voice.
"But why do you say such things? I didn't realize that I had upset you somehow."
Arobin then kissed Edna's hand. Edna gathered as much strength as she could and managed to say, "That's quite enough, Mr. Arobin. I'm afraid that I have accidentally led you to believe that I wanted something else from you other than friendship. Please go."
"I enjoyed our time together. I have become very attracted to you. But don't worry about it. If you don't want me to stay, then I won't. I just hope that we may see each other again soon. Will we?"
he asked. Edna did not answer. After he had gone, Edna could not help feeling that she had done something terrible behind Robert's back. She wondered if he would be angry with her. Her husband never once entered her thoughts. She did not love him. Alcée, too, was nothing to her. However, his touch and kisses on her hand made her feel like she was drunk. Chapter 26. A couple of days later, a letter arrived from Alcée Arobin, expressing how sorry he was for his behavior. Edna felt a little ashamed for having gotten so angry with him. After all, he had done nothing more than kiss her hand, which was quite common among men and women in society. She decided to send him a letter in return. It was a very funny letter that indicated she had completely forgiven him. She suggested that he visit her painting room any time that he wished. Alcée Arobin showed up at her home almost immediately after receiving her letter. And from then on, he was there almost every day. He was always in a good mood and would do anything that she wanted without ever objecting. He was like a little puppy dog that never stopped wanting to be around its master, even if the master was unfriendly to it. Edna, however, was seldom unfriendly. They became very close friends, but there was always a sexual desire between them. Arobin would occasionally express this desire in little childish ways, which Edna did not mind. She enjoyed letting that part of her imagination go free from time to time. Spending time at Miss Rice's could make Edna calm down. That woman's piano playing had the ability to touch even the deepest areas of Edna's person. Edna went there one depressing, rainy afternoon. Miss Rice was happy to see her and offered her a drink to warm her up a bit. After throwing a glass of whiskey down her throat, like a man might do, Edna suddenly said, "I'm moving out." Where will you go?" Miss Rice asked without seeming surprised. "Very near, actually. There's a little home down the street from here. I don't want to have to deal with all of those servants anymore. It's all so troublesome." "Well, I don't believe that's the real reason for your moving." "Ah, I see that I can't lie to you very easily. Well, all right. I'm moving because I have the ability to support myself now. I won a good amount of money this year at the racetrack, and my father's been sending me money as well. Not to mention, my paintings have started to sell. Anyway, I plan to move into the little home with only one servant to help me get by. I've already found someone." "And your husband?" "He doesn't know yet. Of course, it'll all sound crazy to him. What about you? Do you think it's crazy?" "I still don't understand why you're doing it." answered Miss Rice. Edna only knew that she no longer wanted to belong to any man. She wanted to be independent. She knew that this would be hard to explain to her husband. After a while, Miss Rice brought out a letter and gave it to Edna. Edna was surprised and excited. "Does he know that you let me read his letters?" "Are you kidding? He'd never write me again if he did. It's obvious that the boy is in love with you. He writes me because a relationship with you is impossible. He's clearly trying to get rid of his feelings, but cannot." She read while Miss Rice played for her. Suddenly, she jumped up from her seat and ran over to Miss Rice, shouting, "How could you keep such a secret? He is returning." "When?" "He only says very soon in the letter." "And that is all I know. Tell me, are you in love with Robert, Edna?" "I am," Edna answered without any hesitation. It was the first time she had ever said it aloud. "What's your plan for his coming back?" "I don't have one, except to be happy once again." Her happiness had already begun. She ran home laughing in the same rain that had, just a few hours before, so upset her. She stopped at a candy store and bought lots of candy to send to her boys in Iberville. And when she got home, she wrote her husband a very nice letter about her plans to move into another home for a short time. There was nothing of her sadness or anger in the letter. It was full of nothing but her hopes for the future. Chapter 27. Alcée asked Edna why she was behaving so differently lately. She had never so often been in such a good mood.
"What's going on?"
he asked, sitting next to her in front of the fire, occasionally playing with the hair that threatened to hang down over her eyes. She did not mind this at all. "I'm trying to find out what kind of person I am. Sometimes I feel like I'm an extremely evil one, but at the same time, I can't totally believe that is true," she answered.
"Why don't you just ask me instead of bothering yourself?"
he suggested, moving his fingers along her face now. "But I'm sure that you would say only nice things about me. That's not helpful. Miss Rice said something strange to me today, just as I was leaving. She said that she hoped my wings were strong enough to keep me flying high above the customs and habits of society, for it is so sad to see little tired and injured birds fall back to the ground."
"But why do you talk about her when I was just about to tell you about yourself?"
asked Arobin. They looked at each other for a while, both faces glowing in the gold light of the fire. Then Arobin kissed her. Edna kissed him back and even put her hands on his head to keep him there longer. When he left, Edna became lost in her thoughts. She felt many things all at the same time. She was aware of the disapproval that both her husband and Robert would feel if they had known about the kiss. But even more than that, she felt that she understood what it meant to be alive. And she was a little disappointed, for the kiss she had just experienced had no love in it. The next day, without having received any permission from her husband, Edna began to pack her things to move. She was very anxious to go. Her husband's home did not seem to want her there. She would take only the things that she had bought with her own money. Alcée Arobin found her hard at work, gathering her things together. He had prepared himself for the possibility that she might behave strangely toward him. He remained calm when she greeted him, a little coldly, as she was trying to take down a picture that had been placed high up on the wall.
"Please, Edna, you're frightening me up there. Why don't you let me do that for you?"
he suggested. After several minutes of polite arguing, Edna finally agreed to let Arobin deal with taking down the pictures. He made a joke of wearing a bandana the way that women do when they clean. Everyone laughed at how funny he looked. When he finished with the pictures, he joined Edna in the living room, where she was helping her servant clean.
"All right, I'm done. Anything else I can do?"
he asked. "No, that's it. My servant can finish everything else."
"All right. Well then, tell me, are you having a dinner to celebrate your moving out?"
"Of course. The dinner's going to be the day after tomorrow. Afterward, I'll officially move into my new home. Ellen," she then said, turning to her servant, "would you mind getting me a drink? I'm extremely thirsty from all of this hard work." After the servant left the room, Arobin lowered his voice and said,
"But will we see each other before then? Tonight? Tomorrow? It's so difficult for me to wait to be with you for so long."
"I'm very busy now, Alcée. We won't see each other before the dinner, I'm afraid." However, she said this with a little smile on her face that gave Arobin hope that she might actually find time to be with him earlier than that. Chapter 28. Edna's dinner turned out to be quite small, 10 people in total. She had invited 12, however. Adele was feeling ill, and Madame Lebrun could not come for some reason. However, her son Victor was there, as well as Mr. Ratignolles. Among the other guests were Arobin, of course, Miss Rice, Mr. and Mrs. Highcamp, and 2 other couples that were fairly close to Edna. The dinner went very well. Edna used only her best plates and bowls. Everyone talked about how wonderful the food was. The guests were in an excellent mood. They talked and laughed throughout the evening. Edna, too, was quite happy until that feeling of sadness suddenly came over her again. She could not understand why it hit her so suddenly and on such a happy occasion. She felt a feeling of hopelessness. And then, to make things worse, Victor, who was a little drunk with wine, began, at the request of one of the guests, to sing. Edna immediately realized that it was the song that Robert used to sing at Grand Isle, and shouted for Victor to stop. He, however, thought she was joking and continued, "Stop singing that, stop. I don't want to hear that." She shouted again, this time putting her glass of wine down forcefully on the table and knocking over the bottle. The wine spilled all over the table and on Arobin's trousers. Victor then stopped and politely kissed Edna's hand as he apologized for upsetting her. The kisses awakened a desire in her. The guests then decided that it was time to go. Victor asked Arobin if he was going to go home in the same direction as himself. Arobin said that he was not. And then everyone except for Arobin was gone. He helped Edna to check that all of the doors and windows were closed and locked. Edna had let all the servants go except for Celestine. When they finished, the house was then closed, and together they walked to Edna's new home. It was not far away, only a block from her husband's. She had already decorated the home. It was quite a comfortable little place. When they entered the house, Edna was surprised to find flowers everywhere. Arobin had had them delivered and secretly arranged for Celestine to put them around the house before Edna arrived. Edna was not sure what to think of all of this. She took a seat for a moment.
"You must be sleepy,"
commented Arobin.
"Why don't you go to bed? I'll leave."
"Yes, good idea. I've been feeling so much pressure lately," she said, leaning forward and resting her arms and head on the table before her. Arobin began to gently move his hand along her hair. "I thought that you said you were going," Edna said, a little bothered, but at the same time enjoying the feeling of his touch.
"Oh, yes. I just want to say goodbye first."
He then began to kiss her body.
"You need to take it easy for a few days. You've been doing too much lately."
"Yes, good night then. Bye," Edna said weakly. He did not stop kissing her. She did not resist. Chapter 29. As soon as Mr. Pontellier received Edna's letter, informing him of her intention to move out, he wrote her a letter stating that he disagreed entirely. He was mostly worried about how it would affect his money situation. Along with the letter, he sent a plan for an architect to redecorate both the inside and outside of the house while he was away. He also put a notice in the newspaper that his family would be going abroad during the redecoration. Meanwhile, Edna began to live in her new little home. Having fewer responsibilities, she began to feel happier and freer. She stopped socializing as much as before and no longer cared what other people thought about her. She then decided to go to Iberville to visit her children. When she saw them, real tears came to her eyes, because she was so happy. And it was with real interest and excitement that she listened to the stories that they had to tell her. She played with them for a week and told them all about the changes that were being made on their house in the city. The children asked all kinds of questions about her new little home. They wanted to know where they would be sleeping and if there would be girls next door. Mr. Pontellier's mother was happy with her daughter-in-law's visit. She treated her very kindly throughout her stay, and she was happy to hear that the children would get to stay longer with her while the redecorating continued. When it was time for Edna to return to the city, she felt a little sad to leave her children. But when she actually arrived back in town, she found that the sadness had left her. Chapter 30. Edna tried to work on her painting in the early morning, but finding it too difficult to think, she decided to go visit Miss Rice. On her way there, she met Madame Ratignolle. Her friend complained that it seemed Edna had forgotten her. She wanted to hear about the dinner the other night and to see Edna's new home. "It's not a very good idea, you living alone in that place. I'd suggest that you have someone move in with you until your husband returns. People are saying that Alcé Arobin often comes to your home. I wouldn't trust him at all if I were you. He's got a terrible reputation with women, and he could really make you look terrible to the rest of society." Edna made no comment about this and, instead, told her friend that she had an appointment to meet someone in the city. She promised to visit Adele soon. When she knocked on Miss Rice's door, no one answered. Edna then let herself in to wait for the pianist to return home. Miss Rice had given her the key so that she could come and go as she pleased. Edna often went there in the afternoon to relax and talk about Robert. To pass the time, she sat at the piano and tried to play a simple song with one hand. Then there was a knock at the front door. She cried out, "Come in!" At first nothing happened, but then, a moment later, a figure came through the doorway. It was Robert. She stayed seated to avoid making her excitement too obvious.
"You look great, Mrs. Pontellier,"
he said, walking up to her and putting her hand in his.
"I didn't expect to meet you here."
"Did you just return today?" Edna asked with a shaking voice.
"A couple of days ago, actually."
"Ah, and, well, when did you plan to see me?" she asked, breaking off the stem of a flower on top of the piano.
"I was planning to visit you. But, well, I started work again at the business almost right away. I came back because I felt that Mexico was no better than America for my career."
It hurt Edna to hear that his reason for returning had nothing to do with her. She got up to go.
"You're leaving without seeing Miss Reitz?"
asked Robert. "She won't return until late," Edna answered, putting on her hat and walking toward the door.
"Well, at least let me accompany you home,"
Robert said, following her out of the apartment. When they arrived at her home, Edna invited Robert to come in for dinner. He resisted at first, making excuses that his mother was expecting him. But then he suddenly, completely changed his mind and accepted the invitation. As they waited for Celestine to serve dinner, they chatted about Mexico. "What was it like?" asked Edna.
"All that I did was think about the summer at Grand Isle,"
he answered.
"And you? What did you think about all this time?"
"The same thing. The very same thing."
"What's this?"
asked Robert, picking up a photograph of Alcé Arobin that was lying on the table. "Oh, I've collected many photographs this year. It's for my painting."
"Yes, but why Alcé Arobin?"
"He and I are friends."
"I would hardly consider his face worth painting,"
commented Robert, seeming a little bothered. After dinner, as Robert began to roll a cigarette for himself, Edna noticed that he carried his tobacco in a new handmade bag. "Where did you get that?" she asked.
"A Mexican woman made it for me,"
he answered. Edna became very jealous and began to ask him all kinds of questions about the woman. Robert acted as though the woman meant nothing at all to him. He told her that the Mexicans liked to give presents to foreigners. Then a knock came at the door. It was Alcée Arobin. He had come by to tell Edna that that week's card party was cancelled at Mrs. Merriman's.
"Hi there, Arobin,"
Robert greeted him.
"Why, Robert Lebrun, you're back from Mexico already? I guess that you didn't have much success with the beautiful Mexican women then. Too bad."
"Oh, I don't know about that," said Edna. "A beautiful Mexican woman made him a tobacco bag."
"Really? You must have done quite well then, if you had women making things for you. I'd better be going now. Nice to see you both,"
said Robert, getting up and walking out the door.
"So, what shall we do today?"
asked Arobin. "Nothing. I don't want to do anything but relax. You go ahead and go."
"All right, but I'll be terribly unhappy without you."
"Yes, I'm sure you say that to all of the women, Alcée," she said, feeling terribly bothered that Robert had left so quickly. Chapter 31. Edna woke up the following morning feeling wonderful. Miss Rice's words kept repeating in her head. "That boy loves you." If only she could believe it. Robert had been a little shy around her the night before. She felt that her love for him was strong enough to break through that. And if Miss Rice were right, Robert's love for her would also keep him from being shy for very long. She got up. The servant gave her 3 letters, which were from Raoul, Alcée, and her husband. They were all good. Raoul sent his love to her. Her husband expressed that he'd be back in March and planned to travel with her without any business worries, and Alcée just wrote to say,
"Good morning."
She wrote her son and husband back, but did not bother to send anything to Arobin. She worked for a while that day on her paintings and did some business with an art dealer. Always in her mind was the hope that Robert would come. However, he did not come. Nor did he come the next day or the following one. Alcée Arobin, however, did come. She felt nothing for him. Her mind was always on Robert. However, Arobin continued to come more and more often. After a while, she no longer felt sad or lonely when she went to bed, nor did she wake up in the mornings hoping that Robert would visit her. She made no attempt to see him at his home or office. She did not want to make her feelings too obvious. One day, Edna found a garden which had the best coffee and fried chicken in the city. It was a quiet little area that few people knew about, especially wealthier people, who would have considered it too simple. Edna liked to have dinner there sometimes, and she would take a book to read and relax under the tall trees that stood overlooking the tables. One day, as she was enjoying a meal, Robert walked in through the garden gate. "It seems like I can only meet you unexpectedly," Edna said.
"How did you find this place?"
Robert asked, clearly feeling uncomfortable. "Why don't you help me to eat this meal? It's always too much for me to finish on my own," Edna said, trying to be as cold as he had been to her before. However, looking at him there next to her, all of her coldness melted away. "Are you avoiding me, Robert?" she asked.
Why do you bring so much emotion to this relationship? I won't bother to give you an excuse for not seeing you. Just assume that I've tried several times but never found you home.
It seems that you don't think about my feelings at all. I suppose that a woman shouldn't say such things to a man, but it's become my habit to be more open with people.
I don't know what you want from me. It's like you want me to show you where I've been hurt just so that you can look at it and nothing more.
Eat, Robert. The food's getting cold. They talked a bit more and then finished their dinner. Then Robert accompanied her back to her house. He went in with her and relaxed in a chair while she washed her hands and face. He seemed to be lost in thought when she came back to the living room. She approached him and quietly asked if he was tired. Then she gave him a soft kiss on his lips. Her touch sent a strong feeling through Robert's entire body. He took hold of her and pulled her down onto the chair with him. He held her there.
I've been trying not to love you ever since we separated last summer,
Robert admitted.
I tried to get away from you, but you were all that I could think about while I was away. And it hurt me to think about how impossible it was to have you, because you are married.
He then gave her another gentle kiss.
I got the crazy idea in my head that your husband might somehow give you up to me so that we could then marry one another.
He went on.
That kind of thing has happened to other people before. I came back fully intending to pursue you.
But you avoided me.
Yes, because I realized how wrong it would have been for me to do that. Even if you wanted me to, it still would have been wrong.
I belong to no one now. If he were to agree to give me up, I would just laugh at both you and him. Robert sat up suddenly.
I don't understand.
Then Celestine entered the room with a message from one of Madame Ratignolle's servants. It seemed that Adele was ill and wanted Edna to come and be with her for a short time. She told the servant to tell Adele that she would come right away. When Celestine left the room, Robert took Edna back into his arms and kissed her passionately. You are the only person I love, Edna said. I'm awake now. I understand myself now. We can love each other freely now. Nothing else is important.
Please, stay. Don't leave me now,
begged Robert. I'll be back soon. Just wait for me here. Chapter 32. When Edna arrived at the Ratignolles, she found her friend Adele looking very white and ill. She had been waiting for Dr. Mandelet to come for over an hour and a half. She was very worried and could not stop talking about his not having arrived yet. The nurse was there, calming her down and persuading her to go back to bed. Once the doctor finally arrived, she yelled at him for being so late. He ignored her, being used to this kind of abuse. It was time for Adele to give birth to yet another child. Edna remembered her own experience bringing a new life into the world. She suddenly felt that she should not have come. She did not want to be there any longer, but Adele insisted that she stay with her at all times. It was a long and unpleasant experience. When it was finally over and Edna was preparing to leave, Adele pulled her close and whispered, "Don't forget about your children, Edna. Never forget about your children." Dr. Pontellier insisted on walking Edna to her home if she would not accept a ride in his carriage. As they walked, Edna seemed to be lost in her thoughts.
"I'm so sorry that you had to experience that. It was so unnecessary for you to be there,"
he said.
"She's always terrible to people when giving birth. I apologize for her."
"That's fine. I don't care, actually. I suppose it's important to think about the children often," Edna answered without thinking.
"I heard Mr. Pontellier is coming back soon. Are you going abroad with him?"
"No, I don't think so. I want to live on my own now. I don't want to be forced to do anything. I am my own person now. Only children could make me stay. I have obligations only to the children." Dr. Pontellier understood her meaning and said,
"We're all tricked into believing that we want certain things when we're young. It's too bad. Nature does not seem to care that we're not all made for the same kind of life."
"Yes, but I'm glad that I have woken up from that stupid dream. It's better than remaining stupid my whole life."
"Come to me if you need a talk. I think I'd understand you, and I'll do my best to help you."
"Thank you, but I don't seem to want to share my problems just now. I know it's unacceptable, but I'll only allow myself to do what I want to do. It's difficult because I know it will hurt people. But, oh, I don't want to hurt the smallest people. Well, my thoughts are very unclear right now. I don't know what I'm saying. Good night, Dr. Pontellier." She stopped at the gate to her home. She was thinking about Robert, the time before she left for Adele's, the kiss he gave her, the love he told her he felt. She was so happy knowing that her lover was inside, waiting for her. She tried to think about the children, but her excitement did not allow her to. She would think of them tomorrow. Tonight, however, she would enjoy the company of Robert. She went inside, but could not find him anywhere. A note was waiting for her on the kitchen table. It was from Robert.
"I love you. I can't do this any more because I love you."
She almost fell to the floor after reading these words. She sat down on the sofa and stared out at nothing. She stayed that way for the whole night until Celestine entered the next morning to build a fire. Chapter 33. Victor was repairing one of the boards of the Grand Isle cottages, while Mariquita sat watching nearby. He was enjoying making her jealous by describing the dinner he had attended at Mrs. Pontellier's home. He exaggerated a great deal and made the poor girl think that he was in love with Edna. They were still discussing this when Mrs. Pontellier suddenly appeared from around the corner. She explained that she had come to the island alone by boat, just to relax for a while. Both Victor and Mariquita were very surprised to see her. "Are you going to have dinner sometime soon?" Edna asked. "I really could use something to eat. I think I'll have a swim first, though. Can I have dinner after I get back?"
"Yes, but the water is too chilly now. No one swims this time of year."
Victor answered. "Well, I'll give it a try anyway. I'm sure it'll be fine," she said. Without thinking about anything, Edna walked down to the beach. Her mind was too tired from having thought so much on her sofa the night before. She knew that the only thing she really wanted in the world was to be with Robert. Her husband and Arobin meant nothing to her. Her children, however, were what prevented her from being able to live the life she wanted to live. It seemed to her that she was a prisoner of her 2 sons, and there seemed only one way to escape them. But she did not think about any of this as she went to the beach. The beach was empty except for a single injured bird that struggled to fly above her. The sea seemed to be calling to her, inviting her to join it in its loneliness. She found her old bathing suit still hanging on the wall at the bathing house. She put it on and walked out toward the water. However, when she reached the edge of the ocean, she took her bathing suit off and stood naked on the beach. She felt like a baby that had just been brought into the world. Walking into the water, she found it to be quite cold, but she continued to move further and further out. She felt the sea slowly wrapping its arms around her. She imagined herself running in the fields of Kentucky again, those fields that seemed to go on forever. The further out in the water she went, the more tired she became. Thoughts of her family came to her. Her husband and children did not own her any longer. She felt that if Miss Rice could see her now, she would be very disappointed in her. "You are not a true artist," she would have said. "Artists are much braver than you." "I can't do this because I love you." Robert would never have been able to know what she felt. Possibly Dr. Mandelet might have understood, but now it was hopeless. She was too far out in the sea. There was no turning back. That same feeling of fear she had felt the first night she learned how to swim came back to her for a few seconds and then quickly disappeared. She thought about her father and sister Margaret, and for one last moment she saw the figure of the handsome officer who had visited her father when she was little walk across her family's front porch in Kentucky. And the air was full of the smell of the grassy field.